She fell to her knees in the dirt the moment the wagon pulled away, clutching a torn letter that promised her a husband who never came. The town watched. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Until one man stepped down from his horse and did the one thing no one else in that miserable town had the courage to do. He knelt beside her. If you love a slow-burn Western romance where broken people learn to trust again, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end. Drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The letter had promised her a new life. It did not promise her this. Eleanor Hayes stood in the middle of the dusty road outside Miners Gulch, Montana, holding a suitcase in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other, reading the same 6 words over and over, as if reading them again might change their meaning. Mr. Duncan has decided against the marriage. That was all the note said. No explanation, no apology. Just a clerk's neat handwriting delivered by a boy who couldn't have been older than 12, who thrust the paper into her hands and ran off before she could ask him a single question. She had traveled 11 days to reach this town. 11 days by train and then by stagecoach, sleeping upright with her spine aching and her stomach hollow, telling herself the entire way that this was the beginning of something good. Her father was dead. Her mother had followed him into the ground 4 months later, worn down by grief and debt collectors who came to the door even before the funeral flowers had wilted. There had been nothing left in Ohio for Eleanor except the family name attached to unpaid bills and a marriage advertisement in a newspaper that promised a respectable rancher named Josiah Duncan was looking for a wife. She had written to him for 6 months. She had told herself she loved the version of him that existed in his letters. Careful, polite, describing his cattle and his church attendance, and his hope for a woman who could keep a Christian home. She had packed everything she owned into one suitcase and boarded a train, believing that whatever waited for her in Montana had to be better than watching her mother's casket lowered into frozen ground with nothing but a black dress to her name. And now she was standing on a road in a town she had never seen, holding a rejection written by someone else's hand while the stagecoach driver climbed back onto his seat and gathered the reins. "Wait," Eleanor said, stepping toward him. "You can't just leave me here." The driver, a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained teeth, spat to the side of the road. "Paid fare was to Miners Gulch, ma'am. This is Miners Gulch. Ain't my business what happens after." "I have nowhere to go." "Then I reckon you'd best find somewhere quick." He snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, wheels grinding against the dirt, leaving her standing alone in a cloud of dust that stung her eyes and coated the back of her throat. She did not cry. She had promised herself on the train that she would not cry in front of strangers, not after everything else she had already lost. But her hands were shaking as she folded the letter and pressed it into her coat pocket, and her knees felt suddenly unwilling to hold her weight. Across the road, a small cluster of townspeople had gathered outside the mercantile, watching her the way people watch a wounded animal with curiosity, but no intention of helping. "That's her," a woman in a green bonnet whispered to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice enough. "The mail-order bride Duncan wrote about. Guess he took one look and changed his mind." "Can't say I blame him," the other woman said. "Look at the state of her, travel-worn as an old mule." Eleanor felt her face burn. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at them, though every word landed like a slap. "Reckon her family didn't have 2 coins to rub together?" a man added, chuckling. "Duncan's got standards. Woman like that'd bring nothing to a marriage but hungry mouths." Eleanor's chin lifted despite herself. She had buried both her parents in the span of a single winter. She had sold her mother's wedding ring to pay for this journey. She had nothing left to prove to strangers who knew nothing about the night she'd spent scrubbing floors for other families just to keep a roof over her head after her father's business collapsed. But she also had no strength left to argue with them, not standing in the middle of a road with the sun bearing down and her stomach empty since the last stagecoach stop. She turned instead and began walking toward what looked like the center of town, dragging her suitcase behind her, her shoes already blistering from days of travel. That was when she saw him, Josiah Duncan himself, unmistakable from the description in his letters, standing on the porch of a well-kept house with his arms crossed, watching her approach with an expression of open distaste. Mr. Duncan, Eleanor said, stopping at the base of his porch steps. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I received your note. I think I deserve an explanation at the very least before I'm left stranded in a town I've never set foot in. Duncan was younger than she'd expected, from his letters perhaps 40, with a soft belly straining against his vest, and a mustache he clearly took pride in grooming. He looked her over slowly, the way a man might inspect a horse before deciding not to buy it. You're thinner than your photograph suggested, he said finally, and older looking. I sent you an honest photograph. I expected someone with more to offer. He said it plainly without cruelty in his tone, which somehow made it worse, as if he weren't even angry enough to bother hiding his contempt. I run cattle, Miss Hayes. I need a wife who can host, who can carry herself in society, who'll be an asset to my standing in this town. Not a woman who arrives looking like she walked the whole way from Ohio. I traveled 11 days by train and coach, sir. I imagine anyone would look worn after that. Be that as it may. He glanced past her toward the small crowd, still watching from the mercantile, and something in his expression suggested he was performing for them as much as speaking to her. I've made my decision. I won't be marrying you. Then what am I meant to do? Eleanor's voice cracked slightly despite her effort to hold it steady. I have no money for a return ticket. I have no family left to write to. You brought me here. That's not my concern any longer. Duncan turned toward his door. I'd suggest the boarding house if they'll take you. Good day, Miss Hayes. The door shut behind him with a click that felt louder than it should have. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, feeling something crumble inside her chest that she didn't have the energy to name. Behind her, she could hear the townspeople murmuring, could feel their eyes on her back, waiting to see what a discarded woman might do next. Collapse, weep, beg. She refused to give them any of it. She turned and walked toward the boarding house, instead, her spine straight, even as her legs trembled beneath her skirts. The boarding house owner, a stout woman named Mrs. Pruitt, took one look at her travel-stained dress and shook her head before Eleanor had even finished speaking. I don't extend credit, miss. Not to strangers. Not to anybody, truth told, not since the bank started calling in every note in this town. I can work, Eleanor said quickly. I can clean, I can cook, I can mend. I only need a place to stay while I find employment. Everybody in this town needs work, miss. Ain't exactly flush with opportunity for a woman nobody knows showing up with no husband and no references. Mrs. Pruitt's voice softened slightly, just enough to suggest she wasn't entirely without sympathy. I'm sorry, truly, but I've got my own family to feed. Eleanor thanked her anyway, because there was nothing else to do, and stepped back out onto the street. The sun had climbed higher, and the heat pressed down on her like a physical weight. She had eaten nothing since the previous evening. Her feet throbbed inside her boots. And for the first time since her mother's funeral, she felt something close to despair pressing against the back of her throat, thick and suffocating. She sat down on a bench outside the general store, not because she wanted to be seen sitting there, but because her legs simply would not carry her any farther. She set her suitcase beside her and pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself not to cry, though the effort of holding it back made her whole body ache. You lost, ma'am. The voice was low, rough at the edges, unhurried. Eleanor lowered her hands and looked up to find a man standing several feet away, having apparently just stepped out of the general store with a sack of supplies over one shoulder. He was tall, taller than any man she'd seen since arriving in Montana, with broad shoulders that filled out a plain work shirt, sun-darkened skin, and a jaw shadowed with several days' growth of beard. His eyes were a pale, striking blue, and they were fixed on her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not pity. Something more careful than that. No, Eleanor said, straightening her spine and wiping quickly at her eyes, before he could see too clearly that she'd been on the verge of tears. I'm not lost. I know exactly where I am. I simply have nowhere to go from here. Something flickered across his face, the faintest tightening around his eyes, as if her words had struck somewhere unexpected. He didn't ask further. He set the sack of supplies down against the store's wall, and crouched slightly, resting his forearms on his knees so that he was closer to her eye level without crowding her. "Heard some talk," he said. "About a woman Duncan turned away." Eleanor's face flushed hot with humiliation. "News travels fast in a town this small, I take it. Small towns don't have much else to do but talk." He studied her for a moment longer. "You, that woman, I am." She lifted her chin, refusing to let her voice waver. "Eleanor Hayes, I came here believing I was to be married. I was mistaken." "Man's a fool," the stranger said simply, without embellishment, as though it were a fact as plain as the color of the sky. "Any man who'd leave a woman stranded on a road for the crime of looking tired after 11 days' travel ain't much of a man to begin with." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of it. "You don't know anything about me, sir. You needn't defend me." "Didn't say I was defending you. Said the man's a fool. That's just truth, ma'am, whether you want to hear it or not." He straightened up to his full height again, and Eleanor found herself having to tilt her head back slightly to keep looking at him. "Name's Caleb Walker. Got a ranch up in the mountains few hours' ride from here." "Mr. Walker?" Eleanor inclined her head, unsure what else to say. She had no experience with men who spoke so plainly, without the practiced courtesy that had filled every one of Duncan's letters courtesy that had turned out to mean nothing at all. Caleb glanced toward the general store, toward the mercantile across the street, where the small crowd had mostly dispersed, but a few pairs of eyes still lingered on them, then back to Eleanor. "You got people here, family somewhere you're headed after this?" "No." The word came out smaller than she intended. "I have no one. I sold everything I owned to make this trip. I have perhaps $4 to my name, and no way home, even if I wanted to go, which I don't, because there's nothing left there for me either." She hadn't meant to say all of that to a stranger. The words simply came exhaustion and grief loosening something in her chest that she'd been holding tightly closed for months. She expected him to look uncomfortable, to make some excuse and walk away the way people so often did when confronted with a stranger's misfortune. Instead, Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working slightly as though he were turning something over in his mind, weighing it before he spoke. "There's a storm coming in tonight," he said finally. "Big one. You can feel it in the air already if you know how to look for it. Whole valley's about to get hit hard, and there ain't a soul in this town willing to put you up." "I'm aware," Eleanor said quietly. "Mrs. Pruitt already turned me away. Figured she might." Something like disgust flickered across his face, quickly suppressed. "This town's got a short memory for kindness. Always has." He looked at her for another long moment, and Eleanor had the distinct sensation of being weighed measured, though not in the same cruel way Duncan had measured her on his porch. This felt different, more like he was trying to decide something about himself rather than about her. "I got a spare room at my ranch," he said. "Was my sister's before she passed. Ain't been used in near 6 years. You could stay there. Just until you get your feet under you, find work, figure out your next step. I ain't asking for anything in return, and I ain't offering anything beyond a roof and a meal. You'd have your own room, door with a lock if that eases your mind any." Eleanor stared at him, searching his face for whatever angle he might be working, because in her experience, recent experience, most of all, kindness from strangers usually came with a hidden cost. "Why would you do that?" "You don't know me." "No, I don't." Caleb shrugged the gesture, somehow both careless and deeply considered at the same time. "But I know what it looks like when somebody's got nowhere left to turn. Seen enough of that in my life to recognize it plain. And I ain't in the habit of leaving folks to freeze in a storm just because it's easier to look away." "The town will talk," Eleanor said. "A woman staying alone with a man she's not married to." "Town already talks about me plenty," Caleb said, an edge of something bitter entering his voice for the first time. "One more thing to whisper about won't change much. You can decide for yourself what's worse, riding out a mountain storm alone with no roof over your head, or staying under mine with a locked door and nothing expected of you." Eleanor looked down at her hands, at the suitcase beside her that held everything she owned in the world, and thought of the alternative, sleeping in an alley somewhere, or worse, accepting whatever terms some other man in this town might offer a stranded woman with no options left. She thought of her mother, who had always told her that pride was a luxury poor women couldn't always afford, and that survival sometimes required trusting people you had no good reason to trust. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll accept your offer, Mr. Walker. Thank you." Something in his shoulders eased slightly, though his expression remained as unreadable as before. "Wagon's just down the road. We ought to get moving if we want to beat that storm up the mountain." He reached down without asking, and picked up her suitcase before she could protest, and something about the simple, unthinking ease of the gesture, no performance in it, no expectation of thanks, made her throat tighten unexpectedly. They walked together toward his wagon in silence. Eleanor keenly aware of the stares following them from what remained of the crowd outside the mercantile. She heard someone murmur something about Caleb Walker being a fool himself, now taking in a stranger nobody else would touch. She didn't catch all of it, and she found to her surprise that she didn't much care to. The wagon ride out of a town was long and mostly quiet. Caleb drove with the easy competence of a man who had made this trip 1,000 times, his hands loose on the reins, his eyes tracking the darkening clouds gathering over the mountain peaks ahead of them. Eleanor sat beside him, her suitcase tucked between her feet, watching the town shrink behind them and the wild rising landscape of pine and rock take its place. "You don't talk much," she said eventually, mostly to fill the silence, which had begun to feel heavier than she could bear, alongside everything else weighing on her. "Not much reason to," Caleb said. "Been living alone a long while. Man gets out of the habit." "How long?" He was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor thought perhaps she'd overstepped, asked something he had no intention of answering. But then he spoke, his voice lower, more careful. 10 years near enough, since my folks passed and my sister went with the fever not long after. Just been me and the mountain since." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said quietly, and meant it. "Ain't looking for sympathy." His tone wasn't unkind, just firm, drawing a clear line. "Just answering your question." She let the subject drop, though she found herself studying his profile, the hard set of his jaw, the way his eyes never quite softened, even when his voice did, and wondering what kind of grief could carve a man into someone who lived 10 years without another soul for company, who chose silence and solitude over the risk of losing someone else. The wind picked up as they climbed higher into the foothills, carrying the smell of rain and pine, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low across the mountains like a warning. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter around herself, and Caleb, without a word, reached behind the wagon seat and produced a heavy wool blanket, dropping it into her lap without meeting her eyes. "Storm's close," he said by way of explanation. "Get cold quick once it hits." "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, and wrapped it around her shoulders, grateful for both the warmth and the small, unexpected kindness of it. They reached the ranch just as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, striking the dry earth in dark splotches that spread quickly into a steady downpour. Caleb urged the horses into a final push toward a modest cabin set against the base of a rocky slope, a barn standing a short distance away. And Eleanor caught only fleeting impressions of the place before Caleb was helping her down from the wagon, one hand firm at her elbow, guiding her quickly toward the door. Inside the cabin was simple but sturdy. A single main room with a stone hearth, a narrow hallway leading toward what she assumed were bedrooms, furniture that looked handmade and worn with use, but well cared for. It smelled of wood smoke and leather, and something faintly like sage. It did not smell abandoned or neglected, the way she might have expected from a man living entirely alone, though there was an undeniable emptiness to it, a stillness that seemed to have settled into the walls themselves. "Sister's room is down the hall last door," Caleb said, setting her suitcase down near the hearth. "I'll get a fire going in there for you. Ain't been used in a while, might be cold. You don't have to fuss over me, Mr. Walker." "Ain't fussing, just being decent." He said it simply without any suggestion that it cost him anything to be so, and disappeared down the hallway before she could respond. Eleanor stood alone in the main room, listening to the rain hammering against the roof, feeling the strange, disorienting shift of the day settle over her. Waking that morning, believing she was hours from becoming a married woman with a home and a future secured, and ending it as a guest in a stranger's cabin, dependent on the kindness of a man she'd known for less than an hour. She heard the scrape of a match, the crackle of kindling catching, and a few minutes later, Caleb reappeared in the doorway of the hall. "Room's ready. Fire should warm it up quick enough." He hesitated, something working behind his eyes that Eleanor couldn't quite read. "There's stew on the stove from last night. Ain't much, but you're welcome to it. Looked like you hadn't eaten." "I haven't. Not since yesterday evening." Something tightened in his jaw at that, though he said nothing about it, only nodded once, and moved toward the stove to ladle a bowl of stew, setting it on the small table near the hearth, along with a piece of bread. Eleanor sat and ate in silence, aware of him moving quietly around the cabin, tending to small tasks, giving her space without disappearing entirely. "Mr. Walker," she said eventually, once the worst of her hunger had eased, "why did you really do this? Take in a stranger, nobody else would help." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, standing near the hearth, with his back partially to her, staring into the fire he'd built there. "Watched my sister die in a house full of people who loved her and couldn't do a thing to save her," he said, finally, his voice rough. "Fever took her in 4 days. Wasn't nothing anybody could do. But I remember thinking after, if there'd been one less person willing to sit with her, one less kindness shown in her last days, it would have mattered. Would have made those 4 days worse than they already were." He turned to look at Eleanor directly for the first time since they'd entered the cabin. "Don't know what happens to you from here, Miss Hayes. Don't know if you find work in town or move on somewhere else or what. But I wasn't about to be the reason things got worse for you today, when it was in my power to make them a little better instead." Eleanor's throat tightened, and this time she didn't try quite so hard to stop the tears that gathered in her eyes. "That's the kindest thing anyone has said to me in longer than I can remember." "Ain't kindness," Caleb said, turning back toward the fire. "Just decency. Different thing." She wanted to argue the point, wanted to tell him that in her experience, decency was a far rarer thing than he seemed to believe, and that what he'd done today, however he chose to name it, had likely saved her from a night she didn't want to imagine. But exhaustion was catching up to her quickly now, the events of the day pressing down all at once, and she found she hadn't the strength left to say much of anything. "I should retire," she said instead. "Thank you again, Mr. Walker, for all of it." "Caleb," he said, "ain't much for formality out here." "Then you should call me Eleanor." Something that might almost have been the ghost of a smile passed over his face there, and gone so quickly she couldn't be certain she hadn't imagined it. "Eleanor, then. Sleep well. Storm'll likely rage most of the night, but the cabin's sturdy. Nothing to fear." She retreated to the small bedroom at the end of the hall, where the fire he'd built was already pushing back the worst of the evening chill. The room was simple: a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a small mirror hung crookedly on the wall. But it was clean, and it was hers, at least for tonight. And after the day she'd endured, that felt like more than she had any right to expect. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long while after changing out of her travel-worn dress, listening to the storm outside and the occasional sound of Caleb moving through the cabin, the creak of a floorboard, the soft scrape of a chair, the low murmur of him speaking to something, perhaps a dog she hadn't yet seen. She thought of Josiah Duncan's cold expression on his porch, of the townswomen whispering about her worn dress and travel-thin face, of the 11 days of train travel that had led her not to the future she'd imagined, but to this: a stranger's cabin in the Montana mountains, sheltering from a storm alongside a man who had lost everyone he'd ever loved and chosen solitude rather than risk losing anyone again. She did not know, lying there in the dark, listening to rain hammer against the roof, that the man on the other side of that wall was lying just as awake, staring at his own ceiling, wondering what exactly he had just invited into the careful, guarded emptiness of his life. Morning came gray and washed clean, the storm having passed some time before dawn, leaving the mountain air sharp and cold and smelling of wet pine. Eleanor woke disoriented momentarily, forgetting where she was before the previous day's events settled back over her in a heavy wave. She dressed quickly and made her way to the main room where she found Caleb already awake standing at the stove with his back to her, a pot of coffee brewing and a skillet of eggs cooking alongside strips of bacon. "Didn't expect you up this early," he said without turning, apparently having heard her footsteps despite not seeing her. "I'm not accustomed to sleeping late," Eleanor said. "May I help with anything?" "Coffee's near done. Cups are in the cupboard there." He nodded toward a simple wooden cabinet near the window. They ate breakfast together in a silence that felt slightly less heavy than the night before. Though still unfamiliar, two strangers navigating the strange intimacy of sharing a meal without yet knowing what to make of each other. Eleanor found herself studying the cabin in the morning light, noticing now what she'd missed in the dimness of the previous evening. A woman's shawl, faded, but carefully folded, sitting on a shelf near the hearth. A small collection of wildflowers, long dried, pressed inside a jar on the windowsill. Small, quiet evidence of a family that had once filled this space and now existed only in careful preservation. "Your sister's things," Eleanor said gently, nodding toward the shawl. "You've kept them." Caleb's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Didn't see much reason to get rid of them. Ain't like there's anybody else needing the space." "What was her name?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor wondered again if she'd pressed somewhere she shouldn't have. But then he answered, his voice quieter than before. "Sarah. She was 17 when she passed. Would have been near 30 now if she'd lived. Married, probably. Children of her own." He shook his head slightly, as if physically dislodging the thought. "Ain't much use dwelling on what might have been. I don't think there's anything wrong with remembering people we've lost," Eleanor said. "My mother used to say that grief is just love that has nowhere left to go. I don't think it's a weakness to still carry it." Caleb looked at her. Then something shifting behind his pale eyes, some careful wall lowering for just a moment before he seemed to catch himself and looked back down at his coffee. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was." Eleanor's voice caught slightly. "I lost her 4 months ago. My father the winter before that. I suppose that's part of why I was so willing to travel across the country to marry a man I'd never met. There was nothing left for me where I was, and the promise of somewhere I might belong again was more tempting than I care to admit." "And now?" Caleb asked. "What happens now, you figure?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "I suppose I'll need to find work in town if anyone will have me after yesterday's spectacle. Save enough to determine my next step from there." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "Ranch could use some help," he said finally, not quite meeting her eyes. "Ain't offering charity. There's real work here, mending, cooking, keeping the place in order. Things I let go because there weren't reason to bother just me here. I could pay you fair wage for the work, proper wage, same as I'd pay a hired hand. You'd have this room for as long as you needed it." Eleanor stared at him, surprised by the offer, turning it over carefully before responding. "You barely know me, Mr. Walker." "Caleb," he corrected again, a faint edge of something almost like humor in his voice. "And I know enough. Know you didn't cry in front of a whole town of folks who'd earned themselves the satisfaction of watching you break. Know you thanked me for a bowl of stew like it was the finest meal you'd ever had. That tells me plenty about a person's character, more than most folks bother learning about each other in a lot longer than a day." "I don't want your pity," Eleanor said, some of yesterday's wounded pride resurfacing despite herself. "Ain't pity," Caleb said flatly. "It's a job offer, same as I'd make to any hand willing to do honest work. You want to turn it down on principle, that's your right. But don't mistake fair wages for charity. I ain't got patience for false modesty, and I ain't offering nothing. I don't mean plainly." Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen slightly at the bluntness of it. No performance, no hidden expectation. Simply a plain offer, stated plainly. It was, she realized, the first entirely honest exchange she'd had with anyone since arriving in Montana. And something about that honesty, however gruff, felt more valuable than all of Duncan's careful, practiced courtesy combined. "All right," she said. "I accept. Thank you, Caleb." He nodded once, satisfied, and rose from the table to begin clearing the dishes, and Eleanor found herself rising as well, reaching to help before he could protest, and for a moment their hands brushed over the same plate, and both of them went very still. Neither commented on it, but something had shifted quiet and unspoken in the space between them. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had quite expected. Eleanor rose early each morning to prepare breakfast, then spent her days scrubbing the cabin clean of years of bachelor neglect, mending torn shirts and worn linens, tending a small garden plot behind the cabin that Caleb hadn't touched since his sister's passing. Caleb, for his part, spent his days working the ranch, repairing fences, tending cattle, cutting timber for the coming winter, and Eleanor often found herself watching him from the kitchen window, noting the way he worked with a quiet, focused intensity, as though physical labor were the only language he trusted himself to speak fluently. They did not speak much during those first days beyond what was necessary. But Eleanor noticed things the way Caleb's shoulders relaxed slightly when he stepped into a cabin that smelled of fresh bread rather than dust and disuse. The way he began without comment, bringing in extra firewood each evening before she had to ask. The way he'd started leaving wildflowers on the kitchen table some mornings, never mentioning them, never claiming credit, though there was no one else on the ranch who could have left them there. And Caleb noticed things too, though he was far less willing to admit it even to himself. He noticed the careful, quiet dignity with which Eleanor carried herself despite everything she'd lost. He noticed that she never complained, not once, not about the hard work or the isolation or the ache that must have lingered from Duncan's rejection. He noticed the way she hummed softly while she worked an old hymn he half recognized from his own childhood, and the way the cabin, which had felt like a tomb for 10 long years, had slowly, without his quite realizing when it happened, begun to feel like something closer to a home again. It was nearly 2 weeks into her stay when the first real crack in the careful distance between them appeared. Eleanor had been mending a torn shirt near the hearth one evening when Caleb came in from the barn later than usual, his expression tight and troubled in a way she hadn't seen before. "Everything all right?" she asked, setting down her sewing. "Fine," Caleb said too quickly, moving toward the stove to pour himself coffee with more force than the action required. Eleanor watched him for a long moment. "You're a poor liar, Caleb Walker." He huffed something that might have been a laugh under different circumstances, though it carried no real humor in it now. "Ran into Silas Grant in town today, picking up feed." "Who is Silas Grant?" "Owns the bank in Miners Gulch. Owns half the town outright if you ask most folks, and holds paper on the other half." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He's been sniffing around my land for near a year now. Wants the water rights that run through my property. Been making offers, low ones, figuring I'd get desperate enough eventually to sell. And you've refused. Every time." Caleb's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "This land's been in my family since before the war. My father built this cabin with his own hands. I ain't selling it to line Silas Grant's pockets no matter how many times he comes sniffing around with his lawyer talk and his veiled threats." "Threats?" Eleanor's voice sharpened with concern. Caleb hesitated, and Eleanor could see him weighing how much to say, an old habit of guardedness warring with something newer, some instinct to trust her that he seemed almost surprised to find in himself. "Man mentioned you today," he said finally, his voice low. "Said it was interesting, a respectable rancher taking in a woman nobody else in town would touch. Said folks were starting to talk. Said it wouldn't do my reputation any good come time for him to make his case to the Territorial Land Office about water rights disputes." Caleb's eyes met hers, something fierce and protective flickering in them that Eleanor hadn't seen from him before. "I told him where he could put his opinion of my reputation." Despite herself, Eleanor felt a small, surprised laugh escape her. "I imagine that went over well." "About as well as you'd expect." A faint, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of Caleb's mouth, quickly suppressed. "But I want you to know whatever talk comes out of this, whatever Silas Grant or anybody else in that town has to say about it, you got nothing to be ashamed of. This is my land, my decision to offer you work and shelter. Nobody's business but mine. I don't want to be the cause of trouble for you," Eleanor said quietly. "You've done nothing but show me kindness since the moment we met. The last thing I'd want is for that kindness to cost you something you've spent years protecting." Caleb was quiet for the long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Man like Silas Grant's been looking for an excuse to push me off this land for a long while now. He'll find one eventually, with or without you here. Reckon I'd rather face it with someone in my corner than face it alone, same as I've been doing for 10 years. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for. Eleanor felt her breath catch, slightly aware of some shift happening beneath the surface of the conversation, something neither of them was ready to name outright. "Well," she said finally, her voice softer than before, "then I suppose we'll face it together whatever comes." Caleb held her gaze for a long moment, something unguarded passing across his features before he caught himself and looked away, clearing his throat and setting down his coffee cup with more focus than the action strictly required. "Best get some sleep," he said. "Early start tomorrow. Fence line on the north pasture needs mending before the week's out." "Of course," Eleanor said, rising from her chair, though she found herself lingering near the doorway a moment longer than necessary, watching him bank the fire for the night with the same careful, deliberate movements he brought to everything he did. "Caleb," she said softly before she could stop herself. He looked up. "Yeah. Thank you for standing up for me today. Nobody has done that for me in a very long time." Something raw and unguarded flickered across his face there and gone in an instant. "Wasn't nothing," he said gruffly, though the roughness in his voice suggested otherwise. Eleanor nodded and retreated to her room, leaving Caleb alone by the dying fire, staring into the embers with an expression that, had she stayed to see, it would have told her everything his careful words had refused to say. He sat there a long while after she'd gone, turning something over in his chest that he hadn't felt in 10 long years, something dangerously close to hope and equally close to fear, twisted together so tightly he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Outside, the mountain stood silent and dark against the stars, keeping watch the same way it always had. But for the first time in a decade, the cabin beneath it no longer felt entirely empty. And somewhere in Miner's Gulch, in a well-appointed office above the bank, Silas Grant sat at his desk long into the night, staring at a map of Caleb Walker's land, with the water rights marked in careful red ink, already turning over the next move, in a game Caleb didn't yet know he'd have to fight to the very end. The morning after Caleb's confession about Silas Grant, Eleanor woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices outside the cabin. She dressed quickly and hurried to the window, her heart pounding only to find Caleb standing near the barn with a man she didn't recognize, thin, sharp-featured, dressed too well for ranch work, holding a folded document in one gloved hand. "You've got 30 days, Walker," the man was saying, his voice carrying easily on the cold morning air. "Mr. Grant's patience isn't infinite. The Territorial Land Office is reviewing water rights claims across this whole valley, and if you don't have your paperwork in order, there's nothing stopping the county from reassigning access. My paperwork's been in order since my father filed the claim 30 years back." Caleb said, his voice flat and hard. "Tell Grant he can review it himself down at the county office, same as anybody else. He'd rather not waste the time. He's prepared to make one final offer, generous considering the circumstances." The man's eyes flicked toward the cabin, toward the window where Eleanor stood only half hidden by the curtain. "Especially considering you've got new mouths to feed now." Caleb's whole body went rigid. "You leave her out of this." "I'm only saying what the whole town's already saying, Walker. A man harboring an unmarried woman under his roof, no ring on her finger. That kind of talk reaches the land office too eventually. Men there like their claimants respectable." The lawyer folded the document back into his coat. 30 days. Think on it. Think." He mounted his horse and rode off down the trail, leaving Caleb standing alone in the yard, his hands curled into fists at his sides, his jaw working like he was chewing on words too bitter to say aloud. Eleanor stepped outside before she could think better of it. "Caleb?" He turned, and for a moment, she saw something raw and unguarded in his face before he shuddered it away, the same wall she'd watched him build over and over in the 2 weeks she'd known him. "Heard all that, did you?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I did." She crossed the yard toward him, her arms wrapped tight against the morning chill. "Caleb, if my being here is putting your land at risk, it ain't your fault." His voice cut sharp through her sentence. "Grant's been circling this ranch since before you ever set foot in Montana. He'd have found some other excuse if he didn't have this one." "That doesn't mean I should make his excuse easier to use." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression made her breath catch, not anger, but something closer to desperation, held on a tight leash. "You want to leave, that's your right. I told you from the start I wasn't asking anything of you beyond what you were willing to give. But I ain't sending you off because some lawyer in a fancy coat thinks it'll shame me into selling." "I don't want to leave," Eleanor said quietly, and she was surprised by how quickly the words came, how true they felt the moment she said them. "I only don't want to be the reason you lose everything your father built." Something shifted behind Caleb's eyes, relief maybe, or something even more dangerous than relief. "Then we don't let him win," he said. "Either of us." The wind picked up around them, carrying the smell of pine and the far-off promise of another dry, hot day, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Standing close enough that Eleanor could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, could see the exhaustion he carried like a second skin. Then a horse screamed from inside the barn, high-panicked, unmistakable, and whatever moment had been building between them shattered instantly. "That's Duke," Caleb said, already moving. "Something's wrong." Eleanor ran after him without hesitation, her skirts gathered in one hand, and found him inside the barn, crouched beside a large bay gelding that was thrashing against its stall foam, gathering at its mouth, one hind leg held at a wrong, awful angle. "He got himself tangled in the fence line last night." Caleb set his voice tight with controlled panic as he tried to calm the animal. "Must not have noticed till just now. Legs broke or close to it." "Let me see." Eleanor was already moving past him, her voice steady despite the animal's panicked thrashing. "Eleanor, he could kick your skull and get back." "I've done this before," she said, not looking up, already running her hands along the horse's trembling neck in slow, firm strokes, murmuring low and even, until the animal's screaming eased into ragged, frightened breathing. "My father kept horses before the business failed. I nursed 3 through colic and 1 through a broken leg, not so different from this. Get me clean cloth and something I can use for a splint. Straight boards if you have them." Caleb stared at her for one stunned second before he moved, returning moments later with everything she'd asked for, and Eleanor worked with quick, sure hands, splinting the leg while continuing her low, steady murmur to the horse, who calmed further with every passing minute under her touch. "There," she said finally, sitting back on her heels, her hands trembling now that the worst of it was over. "It's not broken clean through. A hairline fracture, I think, and a bad sprain besides. He'll need to stay off it a month, maybe more, but he should heal." Caleb was staring at her like he'd never seen her before. "Where in God's name did you learn to do that?" "I told you, my father's horses." Eleanor wiped her hands on a spare cloth, her voice quieter now. "And my mother at the end. I nursed her myself those last months when we couldn't afford a doctor to visit more than once. I learned quickly what it means to keep a body from breaking further, even when you can't heal what's already broken." Something in Caleb's face cracked open at that grief. Recognizing grief, Eleanor thought, though neither of them said as much aloud. "You saved him," Caleb said finally quietly. "This horse. He was my father's before he was mine. Last one left from the original herd." "Then I'm glad I could help." Eleanor rose to her feet, brushing straw from her skirt, and found Caleb still watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between astonishment and a dawning, dangerous kind of gratitude. "Duncan was a fool," he said abruptly. Eleanor blinked. "What?" "Turned you away like you were nothing, like you had nothing to offer." Caleb shook his head slowly. Man had no idea what he was throwing back on that road. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, unsure how to answer, and was saved from needing to when the horse shifted and huffed, drawing both their attention back to more immediate concerns. But the moment lingered between them for the rest of the morning, unspoken but undeniable, a small crack widening in the careful walls both of them had built. Word of the injured horse, and of Eleanor's steady hand in saving it, reached town faster than either of them expected. 2 days later, when Eleanor rode with Caleb into Miner's Gulch to purchase supplies, she found herself the subject of considerably different whispers than before. "That's the one who fixed Walker's horse," she heard a farmer's wife murmur to her companion outside the mercantile. Vera Simmons said her boy saw it himself splinted that leg like a trained surgeon. "Didn't look like she had 2 useful hands to rub together when she showed up," the other woman replied, though her tone had lost some of its previous scorn. "Guess appearances deceive." Eleanor kept her eyes forward and said nothing, though she felt some small hard knot in her chest loosen slightly at the shift in their tone. Beside her, Caleb walked close, his hand hovering near the small of her back, without quite touching her, a silent, steady presence that she found herself grateful for more than she wanted to admit. They were nearly to the mercantile door when a familiar voice called out behind them, "Miss Hayes?" Eleanor turned to find Josiah Duncan approaching his hat in his hands, an expression on his face she couldn't immediately read. "Mr. Duncan," she said, her voice carefully even, "I heard talk." Duncan said, glancing briefly at Caleb before returning his attention to Eleanor. "About the horse. About you staying up at Walker's ranch." He hesitated, turning his hat over in his hands. "I've had some time to reconsider. My decision that day, it was hasty, ungenerous." Eleanor felt Caleb go very still beside her. "I'd like to offer you another chance, Miss Hayes." Duncan continued, apparently oblivious to the tension radiating off the man beside her. "A proper courtship this time. I was wrong to judge you so quickly on appearances alone." For a moment, Eleanor said nothing, turning the offer over in her mind. The home, the security, the respectable marriage that had once seemed like her only path forward in this unfamiliar country. Then she looked at Duncan's soft, uncertain face, comparing it without meaning to against the man standing silent and rigid at her side, who had knelt beside her in the dust without being asked who had trusted her with his father's horse and his sister's memory in the same breath. "No, thank you, Mr. Duncan," she said finally, her voice steady and clear. "I appreciate the offer, but I find I'm quite settled where I am." Duncan's face flushed. "You'd choose ranch work over a proper household, over a respectable marriage." "I'd choose honesty over convenience," Eleanor said. "And I've found more of that at Mr. Walker's ranch in 2 weeks than I found in 6 months of your letters." She turned and walked into the mercantile without waiting for his response. Her heart hammering, aware of Caleb following close behind her, and aware, too, of the sound, soft, almost disbelieving of him, releasing a breath he'd apparently been holding. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, once they were alone among the shelves of dry goods. "I wanted to," Eleanor said simply, and found she meant it entirely. The trouble started in earnest a week later. Eleanor woke to the sound of shouting from the pasture, and by the time she dressed and reached the yard, Caleb was already on horseback, his rifle across his lap, his expression darker than she'd yet seen it. "What's happened?" she called, already moving toward the second horse. "Cattle got loose in the night," Caleb said grimly. "Fence lines cut clean through in 3 places. Ain't storm damage. Somebody did this deliberate. Grant. Ain't got proof, but I got a strong notion." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Stay here, Eleanor. I need to round what's left before they scatter into the ravines." "I'm coming with you." She was already swinging up onto the second horse before he could argue further. "4 hands are faster than 2, and you know it." He looked like he wanted to protest, but something in her expression must have convinced him otherwise, because he only nodded once, sharp and quick. "Stay close. Ravine trails get dangerous past the tree line." They rode hard through the pale early light, gathering scattered cattle from the underbrush, and Eleanor found herself surprising him again and again, handling the horse with sure confidence, calling out directions with a clear head, even as exhaustion set into her arms and shoulders. By midday, they had recovered most of the herd, though 3 head remained missing, likely lost to the ravines or worse. You're a hell of a hand for a woman who claims she's never worked a ranch before today, Caleb said, wiping sweat from his brow as they finally slowed the horses to a walk, heading back toward the cabin. I never claimed that. Eleanor said, a faint smile tugging at her mouth, despite the exhaustion weighing on her. I only said I'd nursed horses. I never mentioned I'd spent half my childhood chasing my father's cattle out of the neighbor's corn. Caleb laughed, a short, surprised sound, rough with disuse, as though the muscles required for it had gone unused too long. Careful, Eleanor Hayes. Keep surprising me like this and I'll run out of reasons to underestimate you. Good, Eleanor said. I'm tired of being underestimated. Something passed between them then, warm, unguarded, dangerously close to something neither of them had yet found words for, before the sound of an approaching rider broke the moment apart. It was Silas Grant himself this time, riding up the trail on a fine black horse, dressed in a tailored coat entirely unsuited to ranch country, his expression carrying the particular smugness of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Walker, Grant said, drawing his horse to a stop several yards away. Heard you had some trouble with your fences last night. Did you now? Caleb said, his voice gone dangerously flat. Funny considering I never mentioned it to anybody in town. Grant smiled thinly. Small town's Walker, news travels. Funny how it travels straight to the man who's been trying to buy my water rights for a year, Caleb said, urging his horse a step closer. You cut my fences, Grant. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious question. Caleb's voice had dropped low, dangerous. Answer it. Grant's smile didn't waver, though something flickered behind his eyes, calculation perhaps, or the faintest flash of unease. I don't dirty my own hands with fence wire, Walker. I leave that sort of work to men who need the money more than they need their conscience. His eyes slid toward Eleanor, cataloging her with the same cold assessment Duncan had once used, though colder still. Your lady friend's looking well considering the state she arrived in. Word is she's quite handy. Nursed your horse, I hear. Chased cattle today by the look of that mud on her skirts. Get to your point, Grant, Caleb said. My point is simple. Grant's voice hardened. You've got 23 days left before your paperwork deadline. I'd hate for anything else unfortunate to happen to this ranch in that time. Accidents happen so easily out here in the wilderness. Fences, fires, livestock. His eyes lingered deliberately on Eleanor. People. The threat landed like a physical blow. Eleanor felt her blood run cold, but before she could speak, Caleb had urged his horse forward so sharply that Grant's own mount startled backward several steps. You threaten her again, Caleb said, his voice low and lethal, in a way Eleanor had never heard from him. And I will forget every rule of civilized behavior I was ever taught. And you'll find out exactly what kind of man 10 years alone on a mountain makes. You understand me, Grant? Grant's composure slipped for just a moment, real fear flashing behind his eyes before he mastered it again, forcing his expression back into practiced calm. No need for threats, Walker, he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I'm simply pointing out the dangers of remote living. 23 days. He wheeled his horse around and rode off without another word, leaving a tense, ringing silence behind him. Eleanor's hands were shaking on the reins. Caleb, I'm sorry, Caleb said, immediately turning to her, his expression stricken. I shouldn't have let him get that close. Shouldn't have let him say what he said. You didn't do anything wrong. Eleanor's voice was steadier than she felt. But Caleb, he cut those fences. He as good as admitted it. I know. Caleb's jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the tree line, as though Grant's men might be watching from the shadows even now. And I got a feeling this is only the beginning. He was right. 3 nights later, Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke. Not the comfortable smell of the hearth fire Caleb kept banked through the night, but something sharper, more acrid drifting through the crack beneath her door. She threw off her blankets and ran into the main room to find Caleb already awake, standing at the window, his face lit by an orange glow from somewhere beyond the yard. Barn, he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. Something's caught the barn. They ran together into the yard, and Eleanor's stomach dropped at the sight flames licking up the side of the old wooden structure, smoke pouring black against the night sky, the terrified screaming of the horses trapped inside cutting through the darkness like knives. "Duke's leg," Caleb said, already sprinting toward the barn doors. "He can't run fast enough to save himself." "I'll get the horses, you get water," Eleanor shouted, already moving. "Eleanor, no, it's too dangerous." "There's no time to argue." She was already pulling her shawl up over her mouth and nose, running toward the barn doors before Caleb could stop her. Inside, the smoke was thick and choking, the horses rearing in terror against their stalls, and Eleanor moved fast and sure, despite the fear clawing at her chest, throwing open stall doors, slapping frightened animals into motion, driving them toward the exit one by one. She found Duke last, his splinted leg making him slow and panicked, unable to move quickly enough on his own. "Come on," she gasped, coughing against the smoke, grabbing his halter and pulling with all her strength. "Come on, you stubborn animal, move!" The horse resisted terror, overriding instinct, and for one horrible moment, Eleanor thought she would have to leave him, would have to make the impossible choice between her own safety and the animal's life. Then, a burning support beam cracked overhead, and something in her chest went cold and clear and desperate. "Caleb!" she screamed. "I need help!" He appeared through the smoke like something out of a nightmare, soot-streaked and wild-eyed, and together they managed to half-drag, half-lead Duke out through the barn doors, just as another beam collapsed behind them, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. They collapsed together in the yard, coughing, gasping, watching the barn burn beyond saving, while the last of the horses milled in frightened circles around them. "You could have died in there," Caleb said, his voice raw, gripping her shoulders with hands that trembled visibly even in the firelight. "Eleanor, you could have died." "So could you," she shot back, equally shaken. "You went in after me." "Of course I did." The words came out of him like something torn loose, unguarded, in a way she'd never heard from him before. "You think I'd let you burn in there while I stood outside doing nothing?" They stared at each other in the dying firelight, both of them soot-streaked and trembling, and something that had been building for weeks finally broke free of whatever careful restraint had contained it. "Grant did this," Eleanor said quietly. "Didn't he?" "I don't know for certain." Caleb's voice was hollow with fury, barely held in check. "But I got no doubt in my heart." They stayed there in the yard until the fire finally burned itself out, watching the barn collapse into embers and ash. The horses gathered close around them, as though seeking comfort from the only two people in the world who hadn't abandoned them tonight. The barn was a near total loss by morning light, and Caleb stood surveying the wreckage with an expression Eleanor hadn't seen since the day they'd met. Something hollowed out and grim, a man staring down the possibility of losing everything he'd spent a decade protecting alone. "Insurance won't cover it," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Never could afford that kind of policy out here. Barn's gone, feed store with it. Winter's coming in 4 months, and I got no shelter left for the herd, no grain stored for the season." "Then we rebuild," Eleanor said simply. Caleb looked at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. "Rebuild, Eleanor. Do you understand what that takes? Lumbernail's labor money I don't have, not with the herd already thinned from what Grant's men scattered last week." "Then we find another way." Eleanor's voice was firm, unyielding. "You said your father built this ranch with his own hands. I don't believe for one moment that his son doesn't have the same stubbornness in him." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Grief and fury, and something warmer all tangled together. "You really aren't going anywhere, are you?" "No," Eleanor said. "I'm not." Ned. Word of the fire spread through Miner's Gulch within a day, and to Eleanor's genuine surprise, it brought with it something she hadn't expected: help. It began with Mrs. Pruitt, of all people, arriving at the ranch in her own wagon with a load of salvaged lumber from a torn-down shed behind the boarding house. "Ain't much," she said gruffly, refusing to meet Caleb's eyes as she unloaded the boards. "But it's something. Heard what happened. Man doesn't deserve to lose everything just for standing up to Silas Grant's bullying. More followed in the days after a rancher named Tom Ferris arrived with two of his hired hands to help with the rebuilding, refusing payment beyond a hot meal. A widow named Clara Doss brought preserves and bread, muttering something about how she'd never forgiven Grant for foreclosing on her late husband's shop 3 years back. Even the blacksmith, a taciturn man named Otis Bell, who Eleanor had never once heard speak more than a sentence at a time, showed up with new hinges and nails, working silently alongside Caleb from dawn until dusk. "I don't understand," Eleanor said one evening, watching the half-rebuilt frame of the new barn silhouetted against the sunset, surrounded by neighbors who had shown up day after day without being asked twice. "Why now? These are the same people who watched me stand in the road that first day and said nothing." Caleb was quiet for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow, watching the same scene she was. "Grant's made himself plenty of enemies in this valley," he said finally. "Foreclosed on half the families here at one point or another. Folks are scared of him, mostly scared enough to stay quiet when it's somebody else's trouble. But scared people still know right from wrong, even if it takes them time to find their courage." He glanced at her sideways. "Maybe watching you stand up to Duncan, watching you run into a burning barn without a second thought, maybe that reminded some of them what courage looks like." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "I didn't do that to inspire anybody." "I know." Caleb's voice had gone soft, almost tender in a way that made her chest ache. "That's exactly why it worked." The moment stretched between them, warm and fragile, until the sound of Tom Ferris calling for another hand with the roof beams broke it apart, and Caleb turned back to the work with visible reluctance, though not before his hand brushed briefly against hers, deliberate, unmistakable, gone as quickly as it came. The reprieve did not last. 12 days before Grant's deadline, Caleb rode into town alone to file additional paperwork at the county office, leaving Eleanor at the ranch to oversee the final stages of the barn's rebuilding. She was hanging laundry near the cabin when she heard hoofbeats approaching too fast and turned to find two men she didn't recognize riding into the yard, rough-looking, unshaven. The kind of men who carried themselves like violence came easily to them. "You Walker's woman?" the larger of the two asked, not bothering to dismount. Eleanor's pulse spiked, though she kept her voice carefully even. "Mr. Walker isn't here. You'll need to return another time." "Ain't here to see Walker," the man said, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Message is for you, actually. From a mutual friend. I have no friends who would send men to deliver messages while riding onto private property uninvited." The second man laughed low and unpleasant. "Feisty little thing, ain't she? Message is simple." The first man continued, ignoring his companion. "Grant's patience is thin. He's offering one final chance. Walker sells the water rights signs over just that portion of the land, keeps the rest free and clear. Everybody walks away satisfied. Woman like you, though." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You might want to remind him what's at stake if he keeps refusing. Be a shame if something happened to somebody so handy with horses. Or with fire, for that matter." Eleanor's blood ran cold, but she held her ground, refusing to let the fear show on her face. "You can tell Mr. Grant that Caleb Walker doesn't respond well to threats, and neither do I. And you can tell him further that if anything happens to this ranch, to these animals, or to either of us, the first place the sheriff will look is straight to his office." The larger man's expression flickered with something like surprise, quickly masked. Bold words for a woman with nobody around to protect her right now. "I don't need protecting," Eleanor said, though her heart was hammering so hard she feared they could hear it. "I need you off this property before Mr. Walker returns and finds you trespassing." The two men exchanged a look, some silent calculation passing between them, before the larger one finally wheeled his horse around. 12 days, he called over his shoulder. "Tell Walker the offer stands till then. After that, Grant makes other arrangements." They rode off, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the yard, her whole body shaking now that the danger had passed her knees, threatening to buckle beneath her. She sank onto the porch step and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, trying to convince herself that she'd done the right thing, standing her ground, rather than showing the fear that had been clawing at her chest the entire time. When Caleb returned an hour later and found her still pale and shaken on the porch step, his reaction was immediate and fierce. "What happened?" he demanded, dropping to his knees in front of her, his hands gripping her shoulders with barely restrained urgency. "Eleanor, tell me what happened." She told him everything, watching his face darken with each word, watching his jaw clench so tight she feared he might crack a tooth. "I'm going into town," he said the moment she finished, already rising, already moving toward his horse. "I'm ending this today one way or another." "Caleb, wait!" Eleanor grabbed his arm, pulling him back with more strength than she knew she had. "If you ride into town like this, angry, unarmed, against whatever Grant's prepared for, you'll play right into his hands. He wants you to make a mistake. Don't give him one." Caleb stopped breathing hard, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might pull away from her anyway, driven by fury too strong to reason with. But then something in her grip, or perhaps in her voice, seemed to reach him, and he stilled, his shoulders dropping slightly. "He sent men to threaten you," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "On my land, while I wasn't here to stop it." "Wasn't. And I stood my ground," Eleanor said firmly. "I wasn't hurt, Caleb. I'm here, I'm safe, and I need you to be safe too. Riding into town in a fury solves nothing except giving Grant exactly the excuse he's been looking for." Caleb's jaw worked for a long moment before he finally reluctantly nodded. "Then what do we do?" "We fight him the right way," Eleanor said. "With paperwork, with witnesses, with everything legal at our disposal. You said the land office is reviewing claims. We make certain your claim is airtight. And we find out exactly what Grant's real interest in this water is, because a man like that doesn't chase a piece of mountain property this hard without a reason bigger than spite." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something like awe mixing with the fury still simmering beneath his expression. "You've got a mind for this kind of fight. I spent the last 2 years of my father's business watching men like Grant circle him the same way," Eleanor said quietly. "I know how they operate, and I know how to beat them if we're smart about it." They spent the following days in careful, deliberate preparation. Caleb rode to the county land office and secured certified copies of his father's original claim, along with every subsequent filing proving unbroken ownership for 3 decades. Eleanor, meanwhile, began quietly asking questions around town, careful, unassuming questions that revealed more than anyone seemed to realize they were giving away. It was Clara Doss, the widow who'd brought preserves during the barn rebuilding, who finally provided the piece that changed everything. "Railroads coming through the valley," Clara said one afternoon, keeping her voice low as she and Eleanor sat shelling peas on the cabin porch. "Ain't public knowledge yet, but my late husband did surveying work before he passed, and I still hear things. Spur lines set to run right along the water source on Walker land. Whoever controls that water controls where the railroad depot gets built. And whoever controls the depot controls the future of the entire valley." Eleanor finished, her pulse quickening. "That's why Grant wants it so badly. It was never really about water rights at all. Man's been buying up land quiet-like for 2 years, Clara continued. This is the last piece he needs. Once he's got it, every business, every family in this valley answers to him one way or another." Eleanor sat with that information for a long moment, turning it over, already seeing the shape of a plan forming. "Clara," she said slowly, "would you be willing to say that to a land office official? Officially on record?" Clara hesitated, old fear flickering behind her eyes. "Grant ruined my husband's shop, Miss Hayes. I don't relish the thought of drawing his attention again." "I understand," Eleanor said gently. "But if what you're telling me is true, this isn't just about protecting Caleb's land anymore. It's about protecting this entire valley from a man who intends to own every soul in it." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling over the bowl of peas. Then slowly she nodded. "I'll speak to who needs speaking to. For my husband's memory, if nothing else." When Eleanor told Caleb what she'd learned that evening, he sat in stunned silence for a long moment before finally speaking. A railroad depot, he said quietly. That's why he's willing to burn my barn, threaten you, risk everything on a piece of mountain water rights that shouldn't be worth half this trouble. He shook his head slowly, something like grim satisfaction settling into his expression. You found in a week what I couldn't figure out in a year of fighting him blind. We found it together, Eleanor corrected, and now we use it. The confrontation came 7 days before Grant's deadline, when Caleb rode into town with certified copies of his land claim, and Eleanor at his side, prepared finally to end the game Silas Grant had been playing at their expense. They found Grant in his office above the bank, and the moment he saw them enter together, something in his composed expression flickered the first genuine crack of uncertainty Eleanor had seen from him. Walker, Miss Hayes. He rose from his desk, forcing his voice back into practiced smoothness. I wasn't expecting company. We know about the railroad, Grant, Caleb said without preamble, dropping the certified land documents onto the desk between them. Know about the spur line, the depot, all of it. Know exactly why you've spent a year trying to force me off my water rights. Grant's face went pale, then hardened. I don't know what you think you've— Save it, Caleb cut him off. We've got a sworn witness ready to testify to the land office about the survey work her late husband did before your railroad plans went public. We've got my father's claim unbroken for 30 years, filed and certified beyond any argument you might try to make. And we've got 2 witnesses. He glanced at Eleanor, prepared to testify about the men you sent onto my property to threaten a woman alone. Grant's hands had curled into fists on his desk, his composure finally visibly cracking. You have no proof any of that connects to me. We don't need absolute proof, Eleanor said, speaking for the first time, her voice cool and steady, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest. We only need enough doubt to draw the attention of the Territorial Land Office and enough public knowledge of your railroad scheme to turn every family you've bullied in this valley against you. How many enemies do you think you've made in 3 years of foreclosures and land grabs, Mr. Grant? How many of them would be delighted to speak up once they knew the real reason behind your generosity? Grant stared at her for a long, tense moment, something calculating and furious warring behind his eyes. Then slowly, deliberately, he sat back down in his chair, some of the fight visibly draining out of him. What is it you want? He said finally, his voice flat. I want you off my land permanently, Caleb said. I want a written statement notarized confirming you have no further claim or interest in my water rights. And I want your assurance that nothing else happens to my property, my herd, or the woman standing beside me. Because if it does, this story goes straight to the Territorial Office and every newspaper willing to print it. Grant's jaw worked silently for a long moment. Then, with visible reluctance, he reached for a fresh sheet of paper. You've made a dangerous enemy today, Walker, he said quietly, beginning to write. Funny, Caleb said. I was about to say the same thing to you. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the signed, notarized document tucked safely into Caleb's coat pocket, the weight of the last month's fear finally beginning to lift from both their shoulders. It wasn't until they'd reached the halfway point on the trail, the mountain rising ahead of them, against a sky beginning to burn orange with sunset, that Caleb finally spoke. You saved this ranch, he said quietly. Found the answer I'd spent a year looking for, and never once thought to ask. We saved it together, Eleanor said, again the same word she'd offered before, though this time something warmer colored her voice. Caleb reined his horse to a stop, and Eleanor followed suit, turning to find him watching her with an expression she'd never quite seen on his face before, something unguarded. Something that had been building slowly for weeks beneath every careful word and quiet kindness. Eleanor, he said, his voice rough. I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me say it plain without arguing me out of it partway through. Her heart was pounding. All right. When you first showed up on that road, I told myself I was helping you because it was the decent thing to do. Told myself I wasn't looking for anything, wasn't wanting anything to change. 10 years I spent making sure nothing and nobody could get close enough to hurt me again the way losing my family hurt me. He paused, his throat working. And somewhere in the last month, without my permission, without my even noticing it happening, you got close anyway. Eleanor couldn't breathe. Caleb, I ain't asking you for anything, he said quickly, misreading her silence. Ain't expecting you to feel the same, not after everything Duncan put you through, not after everything you've lost. But I needed you to know. Whatever happens next, whatever you decide to do with your life once things settle down, I ain't the same man who found you on that road a month ago, and I don't want to be that man again." The sun was sinking lower behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of burning orange and deep violet. And Eleanor sat on her horse, staring at this man who had rebuilt his own broken heart around the edges of a stranger's misfortune, and felt something inside her own chest crack open in response. "Caleb Walker," she said softly. "I have spent the last 4 months believing I had nothing left worth offering anyone. You are the first person since my parents died who has made me believe otherwise." His breath caught audibly. "Eleanor." But before either of them could say anything more, a distant sharp crack echoed across the valley. Unmistakably a gunshot followed almost immediately by another, and then a third, the sound rolling down from somewhere high on the mountain slopes above the ranch. Caleb's expression shifted instantly from raw vulnerability to hard alertness. "That's coming from near the ranch." "Grant?" Eleanor breathed, her stomach dropping. "He signed the paper, but he's a man who doesn't lose gracefully," Caleb finished grimly, already spurring his horse forward. "Come on, whatever's happening up there, we need to see it for ourselves." They rode hard through the gathering dusk, the warm moment between them swallowed instantly by dread, and as they crested the final ridge before the ranch came into view, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat at what she saw waiting for them below. A thin ribbon of orange light was creeping along the dry grass at the base of the mountain slope. Small still, but spreading with terrible speed in the summer-dried brush, and beyond it, silhouetted against the smoke, already beginning to rise. 3 riders were disappearing fast into the tree line, leaving Caleb's rebuilt barn and everything around it directly in the fire's path. Caleb didn't wait to reach the yard. He kicked his horse into a dead run down the ridge. Eleanor close behind him, both of them watching the thin line of orange fire widen with terrifying speed across the dry summer grass. "The wind's pushing it straight for the new barn," Caleb shouted over the pounding hooves. "If it catches that lumber, everything Tom and Otis built goes up in an hour." "What do you need me to do?" Eleanor called back, already steering her horse toward the water trough near the corral without waiting for his answer. "Buckets, wet sacks, anything that'll smother it before it climbs the grass line. I'll cut a fire break at the tree edge." They hit the ground running the moment their horses reached the yard, and Eleanor didn't hesitate. She'd seen her father's hired men fight a grass fire once years ago, and the memory came back to her hands faster than her mind could catch up. She grabbed the burlap feed sacks from beside the corral, plunged them into the water trough, and ran toward the nearest edge of flame, beating it down into smoking char even as sparks stung her arms and the heat pressed against her face like a living thing. "Lower." Caleb's voice cut through the smoke, hoarse already. "Get low. The smoke rises. Breathe under it." She dropped to a crouch, her eyes streaming, and kept swinging the wet sack down against the flames, licking at the grass, watching the fire die in patches, only to leap up somewhere else a few feet over, faster than she could keep pace with alone. "It's spreading wider than I can cover," she shouted. "I know." Caleb was working a shovel along the tree line, throwing dirt in wide, desperate arcs, trying to cut a bare strip the fire couldn't cross. "Bell over the porch. Ring it loud as you can. It carries down the valley on a night like this. If anybody's close enough to hear, they'll come." Eleanor sprinted for the porch, her lungs already burning, and grabbed the iron bell hanging beside the door, yanking the rope with everything she had. The clanging sound splitting through the night air again and again, desperate and unrelenting. She was still ringing it when she heard hoofbeats coming fast from the tree line. Not from town, not yet far too soon for that, and turned to see a lone rider break from the shadows near the ridge where the 3 men had vanished only minutes before. Young, she registered instantly. Younger than she'd expected. No more than 19 or 20, his face pale and stricken in the firelight. "Ma'am!" he shouted, reining his horse hard beside the porch. "Where's Walker? I can help! I swear I can help!" Eleanor's first instinct was fury, sharp and immediate. "You're one of them. One of the men who rode away from here not 20 minutes ago. The boy's face crumpled with something that looked genuinely like shame. I didn't light it, ma'am. I swear before God, I didn't strike the match, but I was there. I was supposed to be lookout, and I couldn't. I couldn't just ride off and let it burn without doing something. Then help. Eleanor didn't have time to weigh his honesty. The fire was climbing faster by the second, and every hand mattered more than every question. There are sacks by the trough. Wet them, and beat the grass line before it reaches the barn. The boy dismounted so fast he nearly fell, grabbing a sack and plunging it into the trough exactly as she'd done, and within seconds he was beside her, beating down flame with a desperation that seemed to Eleanor like something closer to penance than obligation. "What's your name?" she demanded, working beside him. "Jesse," he gasped. "Jesse Cobb." "Jesse Cobb, if you're lying to me about not lighting that match, I will make certain you answer for it." "I ain't lying, ma'am." His voice cracked. "Man named Frank Pruitt struck it. Grant's hired hand, not kin to the boarding house woman, different family entire. Paid me $10 to ride along as lookout and keep quiet after. Told me Walker had it coming, cheating Grant out of land that was rightfully his to buy." He swallowed hard, beating at another patch of flame. "I needed the money bad, ma'am. My pa's sick, and I ain't proud of what I done. But I swear I never thought he'd actually strike a fire this close to a house with people sleeping in it." Eleanor didn't have the breath to respond, the smoke thick enough now that speaking cost more than she could spare, but she filed his words away like a weapon. Something to use later if they survived the night at all. Caleb appeared through the haze moments later, soot-black and wild-eyed, and stopped short at the sight of Jesse working beside her. "What the hell is he doing here?" "Helping," Eleanor said, coughing. "He's got information you need to hear, but not now the fire's still climbing toward the barn on the east side." Caleb's jaw was tight enough to crack, but he nodded once, filing his fury away, the same way Eleanor had filed Jesse's confession. "Then, we finish this fight first." The next stretch of time blurred into something Eleanor could barely separate into distinct moments afterward, running, beating flame, refilling buckets. The heat pressing against her skin until her arms ached and her throat felt raw as an open wound. More riders appeared out of the darkness within the half hour, drawn by the frantic bell and by whatever word had already begun spreading through the valley. Tom Ferris first, then two of his hands, then, astonishingly, Otis Bell riding bareback with no saddle at all, having apparently not paused long enough to properly ready his horse. "Ferris!" Caleb bellowed. "East line, it's closest to the barn. Get every hand you brought over there now." "On it, Walker." The fight stretched past midnight, a chaos of shouting and smoke, and the terrible orange light licking against the darkness. And twice Eleanor thought the barn was lost entirely. Watching flame creep along dry grass toward the fresh-cut lumber, only to see it beaten back at the last possible moment by hands too exhausted to keep swinging, but doing it anyway. It was near 2 a.m. when Eleanor heard Caleb's voice change, no longer shouting orders, but something sharper edged with real fear. "Duke's out!" He was screaming, sprinting toward the smaller holding pen near the tree line, where the injured horse had been kept separate from the herd since his splinted leg couldn't manage open pasture. "Someone left the gate. He's headed straight for the fire line." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She could see the horse now panicked and limping badly, careening directly toward a wall of flame that had jumped the fire break Caleb had cut earlier, cutting off the safest path back toward the cabin. "Caleb, don't—" she started, but he was already running full speed into the smoke, and she had no choice but to follow her lungs, screaming, her vision blurring with tears from the heat and the smoke both. She found him seconds later wrestling with the terrified animal's halter, trying to turn Duke away from the flames, while the horse fought him with the last of its panicked strength. And just as Caleb finally managed to get the animal turned, a burning branch cracked loose from a nearby pine and crashed down, not 3 feet from where he stood, showering sparks across his shoulder and forcing him to stumble backward directly into the horse's flank. Duke reared. Caleb went down hard. "Caleb!" Eleanor's scream tore out of her before she could think, and she was running before her mind had even fully processed what she'd seen, dropping to her knees beside him in the scorched grass. smoke rolling thick around them both. "Caleb, look at me. Are you hurt?" He was conscious, gasping, one hand pressed hard against his ribs, his face contorted with pain. He was clearly trying to swallow down. "Winded," he managed. "Just winded. Get Duke, don't let him bolt again. I don't care about the horse right now, I care about you." "Eleanor." His hand found her wrist, gripping tight despite the pain evident in his face. "The horse, please." She hesitated one agonized second longer before turning and catching Duke's trailing lead rope, hauling the animal to a stop with strength she didn't know she still had left in her. And only then did she turn back to find Caleb struggling to his feet, one arm curled protectively against his side. "You're hurt," she said, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "Don't tell me you're fine. I watched you go down." "Ribs," he admitted, wincing as he took a step. "Cracked maybe. Not broke clean, I don't think. I've had worse." "That's not comforting in the way you seem to think it is." Despite everything, despite the smoke and the pain evident in every line of his face, something like a laugh escaped him, short-pained but real. Fair point. They made their way back toward the fire line together, Eleanor keeping one arm braced against his back without asking permission, and Caleb, for once, didn't argue against the help. The fire finally died sometime past 3 in the morning, reduced to smoking black patches across scorched grass that would take a full season to recover. But the barn, Tom Ferris and Otis Bell, and half a dozen others' hard-won labor, stood intact, singed along one wall, but standing. The herd was accounted for, shaken, but alive. And nobody, against every terrible possibility of the night, had been seriously hurt beyond Caleb's ribs and a scattering of minor burns among the men who'd fought hardest at the fire's edge. They gathered near the porch as the adrenaline finally began to drain out of exhausted bodies, passing water and what coffee Eleanor could manage to brew, with hands still trembling from the night's fight. And it was there, in the gray hour before dawn, that Jesse Cobb finally stepped forward to say what he'd been carrying since he first rode in. "Mr. Walker." He said, his voice small against the weight of what he was about to admit. "I need to tell you something, and I understand if you want to see me hanged for it once you hear it." Caleb, seated on the porch step with one hand still braced against his ribs, looked up at him with an expression carved from stone. "Talk." Jesse told it plainly, the same account he'd given Eleanor in the chaos of the fire. Frank Pruitt striking the match on Grant's orders, $10 paid for a lookout silence, a sick father back home that had made the money impossible to refuse. His voice cracked more than once, and by the end of it, he was staring at the ground, unable to meet Caleb's eyes. "I ain't asking forgiveness," he said finally. "I know what I did was wrong the second I saw that fire catch faster than Frank said it would. I turned back the moment I could, and I fought it same as everybody else once I got here. But I know that don't undo what I done to get it started." The porch had gone silent, every exhausted face turned toward Caleb, waiting to see how he'd answer. Eleanor watched him carefully, watched the fury still simmering behind his eyes. War with something else, the same instinct perhaps, that had made him kneel beside a stranger in the dust a month ago instead of riding past. "How old are you, Jesse?" Caleb asked finally. 19, sir." "And your pa? How sick?" Jesse's jaw trembled. "Doctor says his lungs are failing. Been that way near a year now. Ma's been taking in wash to keep food on the table, but it ain't near enough, not with medicine costing what it does." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath, watching him weigh justice against mercy in real time on his weathered face. "You're going to ride to the sheriff in the morning," Caleb said finally. "And you're going to tell him everything you told me, plain and complete, holding nothing back. Frank Pruitt's name, Grant's involvement, all of it. You do that, and I won't press charges against you personal. You don't do that, and I'll make certain the sheriff hears it from me instead, and it won't go easy for you." Jesse's head came up, something like desperate hope flickering across his young face. "You do that? Let me walk free after what I done." "I didn't say free." Caleb said, his voice hard, but not without warmth beneath it. "I said I wouldn't press charges. What the law decides once you've told the truth is between you and the sheriff. But a boy who turns back to fight a fire he helped set, who comes forward on his own before anybody forces him to, that boy's got something worth salvaging in him. I ain't in the business of crushing that when it's staring me plain in the face. Eleanor felt something warm and fierce swell in her chest watching him. This man who had every right to fury, choosing instead to see the frightened, desperate boy standing in front of him rather than only the crime he'd been part of. Jesse's voice broke entirely. "Thank you, Mr. Walker. I swear to you, I'll make this right." "See that you do," Caleb said. "And Jesse, when you talk to the sheriff, you make certain you tell him about the railroad, about why Grant wants this water so bad he's willing to burn a man's barn twice over to get it." Jesse nodded, wiping roughly at his eyes, and mounted his horse to ride for town, immediately refusing even to wait for daylight, as though outrunning his own shame required starting that instant. The others began drifting toward their own horses shortly after exhaustion, and the coming dawn urging them back toward homes and beds they'd abandoned hours before, until only Eleanor and Caleb remained on the porch, the sky beginning to pale toward gray in the east. "You did a good thing," Eleanor said quietly, once the yard had emptied. "Giving that boy a chance. Don't know if it was good," Caleb admitted, wincing as he shifted his weight on the step. "No, it was right, though. Different things sometimes." "You're in pain," Eleanor said, her voice sharpening with concern, now that the crisis had passed enough to let her fully register it. "Let me see your ribs properly. You've been favoring that side since you fell." "Ain't necessary." Caleb Walker. "I have splinted a horse's leg and fought a wildfire with you tonight. I think I've earned the right to insist on tending your injuries without argument." Something in his exhausted face softened, and after a long moment, he nodded, allowing her to help him inside and ease his shirt carefully away from skin already darkening with ugly bruising along his ribs. "Nothing feels broken through." Eleanor said, her fingers gentle but thorough as she pressed carefully along the bruised area, watching his face for the wince that would tell her she'd found something worse than bruising. "Cracked likely same as you guessed. You'll need to bind it tight and rest or it'll heal wrong and pain you for months." "Ain't got time to rest," Caleb said, though the protest came out weaker than his usual stubbornness. "Grant's deadline's still coming whatever paper he signed. Barn needs finishing repairs. The herd needs a rancher who isn't laid up worse in 2 weeks because he refused to let a cracked rib heal properly," Eleanor said firmly, already tearing a clean sheet into strips to bind his ribs. "You survived tonight, Caleb. Don't undo that by being stubborn tomorrow." He watched her work in silence for a long moment, something unguarded and raw in his expression that had nothing to do with physical pain. "I thought I was going to lose you tonight," he said quietly, once she'd finished binding the wrap. "When that beam came down, when Duke reared for 1 second, before I even thought about my own ribs, all I could think was that I hadn't told you yet. Hadn't said it plain enough that you'd know if something happened to either one of us." Eleanor's hand stilled against the bandage. "Told me what?" Caleb reached up his fingers, finding hers, holding them gently, despite the visible pain the movement cost him. "I told you on the ridge before the fire started that I wasn't the same man who found you on that road. That's true. But it ain't the whole truth, and I think you deserve the whole truth, especially after a night like tonight." Eleanor's breath had gone shallow, her heart pounding loud enough she was certain he could hear it in the quiet cabin. 10 years. Caleb continued, his voice rough. "I told myself silence was safer than losing somebody else. Told myself the mountain was enough, that I didn't need anybody, that wanting people close only meant more grief waiting down the road when they left, same as everybody always left one way or another." He shook his head slowly. "And then you showed up in the dirt of that road, refusing to break in front of a whole town that wanted to watch you shatter, and something in me that had been asleep a decade just woke up. Started wanting things again. Started being afraid again, not of losing what I already had, but of never having had the courage to reach for something more in the first place." "Caleb." Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "I ain't going to say I love you," he continued before she could interrupt further, his eyes fierce and unguarded in the gray morning light filtering through the window. "Not because it ain't true. God help me, Eleanor. I think it might be, but because that word's too small, too easy for what I actually mean. What I mean is this. I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to the man I was before you showed up broken, and refusing to stay broken. I don't want silence anymore. I don't want a house that only carries the sound of my own footsteps. Whatever's between us. Whatever this is, I don't want to lose it, and I sure as hell don't want to go back to a life without it. Baby. Eleanor felt tears gathering hot and unstoppable spilling down her face before she could stop them. That is the single truest thing anyone has ever said to me, Caleb Walker. Is it enough? He asked, his voice suddenly uncertain in a way she hadn't heard from him before, vulnerable in a manner that made her chest ache. I ain't got much to offer beyond a burned barn and a fight with a man who wants my land bad enough to threaten murder over it. I ain't got the comforts Duncan could have given you, or the safety a smarter woman might choose instead. Caleb. Eleanor pressed her palm gently against his cheek, feeling him lean into the touch, despite everything, despite the exhaustion and pain and fear the night had carved into both of them. I don't want comfort. I don't want safety bought with somebody else's cold indifference. I want this, a man who ran into a burning barn for a horse he loves, who gave a frightened boy a second chance. He didn't have to give, who told me the truth even when it cost him something to say it plain. I have never in my life felt more certain of anything than I feel right now. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the weight of everything unspoken finally settling into something solid between them. Then Caleb closed the distance, slow and careful, despite his injured ribs, and kissed her gentle, at first questioning, and then deepening as Eleanor's hands came up to hold him steady, both of them tasting smoke and exhaustion and something far sweeter beneath it. When they finally broke apart, Caleb's forehead resting against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily, he let out a rough, disbelieving laugh. 10 years, he said softly. 10 years I convinced myself I didn't want this. Funny how wrong a man can be about his own heart. Not funny. Eleanor murmured, her own smile trembling at the edges. Just human. They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in the fragile peace of survival and confession. Both until the sound of an approaching rider shattered the quiet entirely. Caleb was on his feet instantly, despite his ribs moving toward the window, and Eleanor followed close behind, her heart lurching at the sight of the horse thundering up the trail. Not Jesse. Returning, not one of Grant's men come to finish what the fire had started, but the county sheriff himself. His badge catching the early morning light, his expression grim as he reined his horse to a stop in the yard. Walker, the sheriff called, dismounting fast. Got a boy down at my office confessing to arson, naming Silas Grant as the man behind it. Says there was a fire out here last night. That true? True as anything I've ever said, Caleb replied, stepping out onto the porch, despite Eleanor's hand tightening on his arm in silent protest at the movement. Barns scorched, herds shaken, and my ribs got a story to tell besides. The sheriff's jaw tightened. Grant's already sent word he's filing a complaint against you for trespass and threats, trying to get ahead of whatever story might come out against him. Man's desperate, which tells me the boy's confession is likely more true than not. It's true, Eleanor said firmly, stepping forward. I witnessed the fire start, watched 3 riders flee the scene, and Jesse Cobb himself confessed the entire scheme to both of us directly, including the name of the man who struck the match, and the reason behind it, a railroad spur line Grant intends to control by forcing Mr. Walker off his water rights. The sheriff's eyebrows rose sharply. Railroad, you say? I have a witness prepared to testify to survey information confirming it, Eleanor continued. Clara Doss. Her late husband did the original survey work. The sheriff studied them both for a long moment, something shifting behind his weathered eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or the dawning recognition that the case in front of him was considerably larger than a simple property dispute. This changes things, he said finally. A scheme this size involving railroad interests and attempted murder by arson, that ain't something I can settle local anymore. This needs a federal marshal, maybe a circuit judge to hear it proper, considering the scope. Then get one, Caleb said, his voice hard as iron, despite the pain still evident in his stance. Because I intend to see Silas Grant answer for every single thing he's done to this valley, not just to my land, but to every family he's foreclosed, on every business he's strangled, every threat he's made against people who couldn't fight back. The sheriff nodded slowly, something like respect entering his expression for the first time. "I'll send word to the territorial marshal's office today. These things take time, Walker. Could be weeks before a circuit judge makes it out this way to hear a case this size." "We've got time," Caleb said, glancing sideways at Eleanor, something warm passing between them, despite the gravity of the conversation. "We ain't going anywhere." The sheriff mounted his horse to ride back toward town, leaving behind him a silence heavy with everything still unresolved, Grant's fury certain to escalate rather than retreat. Now that his scheme had been exposed, a federal case that would take weeks to properly convene, and a barn still smoking at its edges, as testament to exactly how far their enemy was willing to go. Eleanor turned to find Caleb watching her. His expression a complicated mixture of exhaustion, pain, and something fiercely protective that hadn't diminished despite everything the night had cost them both. "This ain't over," he said quietly. "Grant knows now that we've got proof, got witnesses, got the law finally paying attention. A man like that cornered, he don't get safer, he gets more dangerous." "I know," Eleanor said, though her voice held none of the fear such words should have carried. "But we're not facing it alone anymore. Jesse's confessed. Clara's prepared to testify. Half this valley showed up last night to fight a fire that wasn't their responsibility to fight, because they're done being afraid of what Grant might do to them if they stand against him." Caleb reached for her hand again, his grip firm despite everything the night had taken out of him. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we face it the same way we faced tonight, together." Eleanor nodded though, even as she said it, some small, cautious part of her mind whispered that Silas Grant was not a man accustomed to losing, and that a cornered enemy with resources and reputation still intact was far from finished. Fighting a fear that proved itself justified faster than either of them expected, when barely an hour later, a second rider appeared on the ridge above the ranch, moving with none of the urgency of the sheriff's visit, but with a slow, deliberate menace that made the hair rise on the back of Eleanor's neck the moment she spotted him. "Caleb," she said quietly, nodding toward the ridge. "We have company again." Caleb followed her gaze, his exhausted body going rigid with fresh alertness, and as the rider drew close enough to make out clearly against the pale morning light, Eleanor felt her stomach drop entirely. It wasn't Grant himself, and it wasn't one of his hired hands. It was Josiah Duncan riding hard toward the ranch, with an expression on his face that suggested whatever news he carried was urgent enough to override every ounce of pride that had kept him away since Eleanor's public refusal of his second proposal, and the moment he reined his horse to a stop in the scorched yard, breathless and pale. His first words confirmed exactly how much worse the morning was about to become. "Grant knows about Jesse's confession," Duncan said, not bothering with pleasantries, his eyes darting between Eleanor and Caleb with something like genuine fear. "He's already sent riders to intercept the boy before he reaches the sheriff a second time to give a formal written statement. And he's put a bounty out quiet-like through men who owe him money $500 to whoever silences the witnesses before the circuit judge ever hears this case." Duncan's words hung in the smoke-stained air like a struck match. $500? Caleb repeated, his voice gone flat and cold. "For silencing witnesses." "That's what I heard," Duncan said, still catching his breath. "I was at the bank settling accounts when Grant's clerk let it slip to another man, thinking I was too preoccupied with my own business to listen. Grant's desperate, Walker. The railroad deal falls apart entirely if the territorial office hears sworn testimony before he can force a sale." Eleanor's mind was already racing ahead of the fear clawing at her chest. "Jesse rode for the sheriff's office before dawn. If Grant's men intercept him on the road, they won't reach the sheriff's office," Caleb said grimly, already moving toward his horse, despite the visible wince the motion cost his bound ribs. "Not if they catch him on the trail first, where there's nobody to witness it." "Caleb, your ribs can wait." His jaw was set in a hard line that told Eleanor arguing would cost precious minutes neither of them had. "Duncan, which road would Grant's men take to cut Jesse off?" Duncan hesitated only a moment. "The low trail past the creek crossing. It's faster than the ridge road Jesse would have taken, especially riding hard through the dark." "Then that's where we're headed." Caleb swung up into the saddle, his face pale with pain he was refusing to acknowledge. "Eleanor, stay here, bar the door," Absolutely not. Eleanor was already untying her own horse, her hands steady despite the fear hammering through her veins. You're injured, Caleb. You need someone riding beside you who can think clearly if this goes wrong. This isn't a discussion, Eleanor. There are men out there willing to kill, which is exactly why you shouldn't be riding into it with cracked ribs and no one to watch your back. Her voice cracked with an intensity that stopped him mid-argument. I have already run into a burning barn for you. I am not staying behind now while you ride toward armed men alone. Something in Caleb's expression cracked open fear for her, warring visibly against the plain fact that she was right, that arguing further would only waste time they didn't have. Fine, he said finally, tight and clipped. But you stay behind me, and the second I tell you to run, you run. No arguing, you understand. I understand. Duncan cleared his throat awkwardly from where he still sat astride his horse. I'll ride for the sheriff, directly tell him what I heard, see if he can spare a deputy to help search the trails. Duncan. Caleb's voice stopped him before he could turn his horse. I don't know why you're helping us after everything, but I won't forget it. Duncan's face colored slightly, something almost sheepish crossing his features. I misjudged Miss Hayes badly when she first arrived. Been sitting with that mistake for weeks now, watching this whole valley talk about what she's become to this ranch, what she's willing to fight for. Man ought to be able to admit when he's been a fool. He tipped his hat briefly toward Eleanor. Godspeed to you both. He rode hard toward town, and Caleb and Eleanor turned their horses toward the low trail, pushing their mounts into a gallop that left no room for further conversation. Only the pounding rhythm of hooves against packed earth, and the tight, silent fear that had settled between them both. They found the creek crossing empty at first, no sign of Jesse, no sign of Grant's men, and for one terrible moment, Eleanor's mind conjured every possible awful outcome, before Caleb's sharp intake of breath drew her attention to a scattering of hoofprints veering off the main trail into the brush. Somebody left the road here, Caleb said, already dismounting, despite his ribs crouching to examine the marks in the soft creekside mud. Struggle by the look of it. See how the prints scatter, how deep they're cut here. He pointed to a patch of disturbed earth. Somebody got pulled off their horse. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Jesse. Maybe. Caleb was already remounting, his face grim. Or maybe Grant's men if Jesse managed to fight back. Either way, this trail leads somewhere, and we're not leaving without knowing where. They followed the tracks deeper into the brush, moving slower now, more cautious, until the unmistakable sound of raised voices carried through the trees ahead, and Eleanor's stomach lurched at the sound of Jesse's voice, high and frightened, cutting through the morning air. I already told the sheriff you can't undo words already spoken. We can make sure you don't speak no more of 'em, a rougher voice answered. Judge can't hear testimony from a dead boy. Caleb's face went white with fury. He raised a hand signaling Eleanor to stay back, and dismounted silently, drawing his rifle from its saddle scabbard with practiced, deadly quiet. Eleanor's heart hammered so violently she feared it might give them away before Caleb could even reach the clearing where the voices originated. She watched him move through the trees with the careful, controlled tension of a man who had spent a decade alone in wild country, learning exactly how to move without sound, and when he finally reached the clearing's edge, his voice rang out sharp and commanding. Let the boy go. Eleanor edged closer just enough to see through the brush. Jesse on his knees in the dirt, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow. Two men standing over him, one holding a pistol loosely at his side. Frank Pruitt, she realized, recognizing the description Jesse had given the night before. And beside him, a second man she didn't recognize, older, harder-looking, his hand resting near his own holstered weapon. Frank's eyes flicked toward Caleb, calculating. This ain't your business, Walker. Boys on my land near enough. Caleb set his rifle steady despite the visible strain in his stance. Makes it my business. He's a liar and an oath breaker, Frank spat. Made his own bed taking money from Grant and then running his mouth to the sheriff first chance he got. Man's got no honor left to protect. He's got more honor than you'll ever manage, Caleb said. Turning back to fight the fire he helped set, coming forward to confess what he'd done, that's more courage than you've shown standing here threatening a 19-year-old boy on his knees. The older man's hand twitched toward his holster, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Terror seizing her chest so completely, she nearly cried out. But before he could draw another voice cut through the tension, a new rider crashing through the brush from the opposite direction, and Eleanor's heart leapt at the sight of a deputy's badge catching the morning light. "Drop it!" The deputy shouted, his own weapon already trained on the older man. "Sheriff sent me ahead when Duncan came in with word of trouble on this trail. Every one of you hands where I can see them." The tension in the clearing snapped like a taut rope finally cut. Frank's shoulders sagged with the particular defeat of a man who'd run out of options, and the older man slowly raised his hands, his weapon still holstered. "This ain't over, Walker," Frank muttered as the deputy moved to secure both men. "Grant's got more men than this, more money than you'll ever have to fight him with." "Maybe," Caleb said, lowering his rifle, only once the deputy had both men properly restrained. "But he's got fewer friends every day, and fewer places left to hide what he's done." Eleanor rushed forward the moment the danger had truly passed, dropping to her knees beside Jesse, examining the cut above his eyebrow, with hands that trembled from the aftermath of fear. "I'm all right, ma'am," Jesse said, though his voice shook. "They caught me off the trail, dragged me here, but I didn't tell them anything more than what I'd already given the sheriff. I swore an oath, and I meant to keep it, whatever they threatened." "You're safe now," Eleanor said softly, though her own voice carried the same tremor his did. "That's what matters." The deputy secured Frank and his companion for transport back to town, and as they rode together toward the sheriff's office, Jesse safely mounted between Caleb and the deputy. Eleanor close behind, she found herself replaying Frank's parting words with a cold, sinking certainty that this fight, however much ground they'd gained, was far from finished. The days that followed brought a strange, uneasy quiet to the ranch, the kind of stillness that Eleanor had learned by now to distrust more than open conflict. Frank Pruitt and his companion sat in the county jail awaiting the circuit judge's arrival, their own testimony offered in exchange for leniency corroborating everything Jesse had already confessed. Clara Doss had given her sworn statement about the railroad survey. The territorial marshal's office had confirmed a circuit judge would arrive within the fortnight to hear the case in full, and Silas Grant, remarkably, had gone silent. "I don't trust it," Caleb said one evening, standing at the window watching the last light fade over the mountains, his ribs healing slowly, but still tender enough that Eleanor caught him wincing whenever he forgot to favor them. "Man like that doesn't just accept defeat quiet. He's planning something." "Maybe he's simply out of options," Eleanor offered, though even as she said it, she didn't fully believe her own words. "Grant's never out of options," Caleb said grimly. "Just out of the ones we can see coming." He was right to worry. The blow, when it came, arrived from a direction neither of them had anticipated. It began with a letter delivered by a stagecoach courier who rode all the way from Helena, addressed to Eleanor in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it on the porch while Caleb worked the north pasture and found herself reading words that made her chest go tight with a complicated mixture of hope and dread. "Dear Miss Hayes, my name is Charlotte Ashford. I am the wife of a prominent attorney here in Helena, and I have recently heard through mutual acquaintances traveling through Miners Gulch of your considerable skill in nursing and household management, as well as your evident strength of character in the face of significant hardship. My husband and I are in need of a governess and household manager for our growing family, a position that would offer you considerable financial security, respectable social standing, and a comfortable home in Helena proper. The salary would be generous, $40 monthly, with room and board included, and I believe you would find our household a warm and welcoming environment. I understand this offer arrives somewhat unexpectedly, but I do hope you will consider it seriously. A woman of your evident capabilities deserves better than the uncertain circumstances I understand you currently find yourself in. Please write with your decision at your earliest convenience. Warmly, Charlotte Ashford." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her mind spinning through everything it represented, a respectable position. Security she hadn't known since her father's business collapsed, a life entirely free from Silas Grant's threats and burned barns, and the constant exhausting fight to protect land that wasn't even legally hers to protect. $40 a month, a proper household. Safety in a way that Caleb's ranch, however much she'd come to love, it could not yet promise. She was still sitting with the letter in her lap when Caleb returned from the pasture, and something in her expression must have alerted him immediately, because his easy stride faltered the moment he saw her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Eleanor said quickly, though her voice betrayed the lie even as she spoke it. "I received a letter, an offer actually, from a family in Helena." Caleb's expression shuddered instantly. The careful guardedness she'd watched him slowly abandon over the past weeks suddenly snapping back into place, like a door slammed shut. "What kind of offer?" "A governess position. Household management for a prominent family." Eleanor held out the letter, watching his face carefully as he read it, watching the muscles in his jaw tighten with each line. $40 a month, Caleb, room and board included. A respectable position in a proper household. He handed the letter back to her without a word, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told Eleanor exactly how much effort that neutrality was costing him. "Sounds like a fine offer," he said finally, his voice carefully even. "Caleb, you should take it." The words came out clipped final, though something raw flickered behind his eyes that contradicted every syllable. "Safe home, respectable work, real wages instead of whatever I've managed to scrape together for you here. Man would be a fool to ask you to turn that down for a burned-out ranch still fighting off a land baron with a bounty on witnesses." "That's not what I said." "Didn't need to." Caleb turned away from her, moving toward the barn, with the stiff, controlled walk of a man holding something back through sheer force of will. "I've got fences to check." Eleanor sat alone on the porch for a long while after he'd gone, the letter still clutched in her hand, her heart torn between two futures that suddenly felt impossibly distant from each other: the safe, respectable life Charlotte Ashford was offering, and the uncertain, dangerous, achingly precious life she'd built here in these few short weeks with a man who had just walked away from her rather than ask her to choose him. She found him an hour later at the fence line, methodically checking each post with more focus than the task strictly required, his shoulders rigid with tension that had nothing to do with mending wire. "You didn't ask me what I wanted," Eleanor said, standing several feet away watching him work. "Didn't think it was my place." Caleb didn't look up from the fence post. "You deserve to make that choice free and clear, Eleanor, without me putting my thumb on the scale. And if I told you I already know what I want." His hands stilled on the wire. Slowly he straightened, turning to face her, and Eleanor saw in his expression the same raw vulnerability she'd glimpsed the night of the fire. A man who had spent 10 years protecting himself from exactly this kind of hope, terrified now that reaching for it might mean losing it all over again. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough, "I watched Duncan turn you away on that road because you weren't polished enough, weren't rich enough, weren't exactly what he'd pictured in his mind. I watched this whole town whisper about you, like you were something less than what you are. And now I'm standing here with a burned barn and a fight against a man with more money and more patience than I've got. And part of me thinks the decent thing, the right thing, is to tell you to take that offer and build the safe life you deserve." "And the other part of you?" Eleanor asked softly. Caleb's jaw worked silently for a long moment, something breaking loose behind his careful control. "The other part of me can't stand the thought of watching you ride away." He admitted the words torn out of him like something physically painful. "Can't stand the thought of this ranch going back to the silence it had before you came, of waking up every morning knowing I had the chance to ask you to stay, and let my own fear of losing you talk me out of it instead." "Then ask me," Eleanor said, her voice trembling now with an emotion too large to fully contain. "Stop protecting me from the choice and just ask Caleb." He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that contradicted the desperate intensity in his eyes. "Stay," he said, the word raw and unguarded. "Stay, Eleanor. Not because I can match Charlotte Ashford's $40 a month, because God knows I can't not yet not, with everything Grant's cost this ranch. Stay because I love you. Because these weeks with you have been the first time in 10 years I've woken up wanting the day ahead of me instead of just enduring it. Stay because whatever fight's still coming with Grant, I'd rather face it with you beside me than win it alone. Eleanor's tears spilled over freely now, and she didn't try to stop them. I already wrote my answer to Charlotte Ashford before I came looking for you, she said. I declined the position, Caleb. I made my choice the moment I finished reading her letter long before you found the courage to ask me to stay. Something broke open in Caleb's face, relief and joy and disbelief all tangled together, and he kissed her. Then fierce and unrestrained, one hand tangling in her hair, while the other pressed her close against him, despite his healing ribs. I love you, he said again, breathless, when they finally broke apart. I should have said it plain that first night by the fire instead of dancing around it. I love you, Eleanor Hayes, and I don't care who in this valley has something to say about it. I love you too, Eleanor said, laughing through her tears. I have for longer than I've been willing to admit even to myself. They stood together at the fence line for a long moment, wrapped in a joy so complete it nearly overshadowed everything still unresolved. Grant's silence, the coming trial, the bounty still technically hanging over Jesse and Clara's heads until the case was fully settled. But even joy, Eleanor would learn within the hour, could not hold back the storm still gathering on their horizon. They were still standing at the fence line, foreheads pressed together, when the sound of an approaching wagon broke through their private happiness. Eleanor turned to see Mrs. Pruitt's wagon careening up the trail at a speed entirely unsuited to the boarding house owner's usual measured pace, and something about the frantic urgency of it sent ice through her veins, even before the wagon drew close enough to make out the woman's terrified expression. Walker, Mrs. Pruitt called, hauling her horse to a stop hard enough that the wagon nearly tipped. You need to come quick. There's been trouble in town. What kind of trouble? Caleb was already moving toward his own horse. Clara Doss. Somebody broke into her home last night, tore the place apart looking for something, left her badly shaken, but thankfully unhurt. And Otis Bell's smithy caught fire, not 2 hours past small fire contained before it spread. But everybody in town knows it wasn't accidental, not with Grant's men seen lurking near the shop beforehand. Eleanor's blood ran cold. He's retaliating against everyone who helped us. Worse than that. Mrs. Pruitt continued, her voice shaking now that the urgency of delivering the news had given way to real fear. Word spreading that Grant's hired men from outside the territory, professional men, not local toughs like Frank Pruitt. Says he's done playing games and intends to make sure this case never reaches the circuit judge at all, one way or another. Caleb's face had gone hard and cold, every trace of the joy from moments before replaced entirely by grim determination. Then we need to move faster than he does. Get every witness somewhere safe before he can reach them. Sheriff's already trying, Mrs. Pruitt said. But he's only got 2 deputies for a whole county. And Grant's got money enough to hire more men than that twice over. Eleanor's mind was racing, already assembling pieces into a plan, even as fear threatened to overwhelm clear thought. The circuit judge. When exactly does he arrive? Word came this morning, Mrs. Pruitt said. 6 days. He's traveling the circuit from 3 other counties first. 6 days is too long, Caleb said grimly. Grant's already moving faster than that. Then we don't wait for him to come to us. Eleanor said, an idea forming with sudden startling clarity. We consolidate every witness in one place, somewhere defensible, somewhere Grant's men would have to fight past a dozen armed neighbors to reach anyone. Here at the ranch. We already proved this valley will show up when it matters. Half the county fought that fire alongside us. If Grant wants to silence Jesse, Clara, and anyone else prepared to testify, he'll have to come through everyone who's already shown they're willing to stand against him. Caleb stared at her for a long moment, something like awe mixing with the fear still evident in his expression. You want to turn this ranch into a fortress? I want to turn it into proof, Eleanor said, that Silas Grant cannot simply buy or threaten his way out of what he's done, that this valley is done being afraid of him. Mrs. Pruitt, to Eleanor's surprise, nodded firmly. I'll spread word myself. There's more folks in this valley owed a reckoning against that man than you likely realize, Miss Hayes. I suspect you'll have more help than you're expecting." She was right. Within 2 days, the ranch had transformed into something Eleanor could hardly have imagined when she'd first arrived as a stranded, rejected bride only weeks before. Clara Doss arrived with what few belongings she could gather, her hands still trembling from the break-in, but her resolve, if anything, hardened rather than broken. Jesse Cobb came too, along with his ailing father, whom Eleanor tended personally with the same careful skill she'd once used to nurse her own mother. Otis Bell arrived with tools and a determination to help rebuild whatever Grant's men might still try to destroy. Tom Ferris brought 2 more hands along with rifles and a grim willingness to stand watch through the night. "Never seen anything quite like this," Caleb admitted one evening, watching the small makeshift community that had gathered on his land, cook fires scattered across the yard, watchful men positioned at the tree lines, the sound of Clara's quiet humming as she helped Eleanor prepare enough food for everyone gathered. Whole valley showing up to stand against one man. "He made enemies of everyone who ever needed mercy from him and didn't receive it," Eleanor said quietly. "That kind of resentment doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment to find its courage." Caleb reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers as they watched the gathering dusk settle over the yard full of neighbors turned allies. "You did this," he said softly. "Turned a bunch of scared, isolated families into something that looks a lot like an army." "We did this?" Eleanor corrected gently, the same words she'd offered him weeks before, though now they carried the weight of everything that had grown between them since. Together. The peace, however hard-won, lasted only 3 more days before Grant made his final, most desperate move, one that would strike not at the witnesses gathered on Caleb's land, but at the very foundation of the case they'd built to bring him down. It came in the form of a letter delivered to the sheriff's office signed by 3 men claiming to be former employees of Caleb's father, alleging that the original land claim itself had been fraudulently filed decades earlier, disputing the very ownership that had anchored their entire case against Grant's water rights scheme. "It's a lie," Caleb said, his hands shaking with fury as he read the sheriff's copy of the letter delivered personally to the ranch by a grim-faced deputy. "My father filed that claim honest, same as any settler in this valley. These men, I don't even recognize these names. Grant's paying them to lie." Eleanor said, fury of her own building hot in her chest. "He's trying to poison the well before the circuit judge even arrives, make the whole case look uncertain enough that the judge dismisses everything, rather than untangle competing claims." The deputy, a young man named Harlan Reeves, whom Eleanor had come to know slightly over the past days, shook his head grimly. "Judge won't take kindly to obvious manufactured evidence, ma'am, but it'll slow things down regardless. Cases get delayed sometimes for months, when land ownership itself comes into dispute. And a delay's about all Grant needs to keep this fight dragging long enough to wear everybody down." Eleanor felt the walls closing in around everything they'd built these past weeks. The careful case, the gathered witnesses, the fragile alliance of neighbors, finally brave enough to stand against Grant's tyranny, all of it suddenly at risk of unraveling under the weight of a lie, clever enough to introduce just enough doubt. "There has to be something," she said, pacing the length of the porch, her mind racing. "Some proof beyond dispute that your father's claim was legitimate." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, something working behind his eyes. Then slowly, his expression shifted, not to hope exactly, but to something like grim, cautious possibility. "My mother kept a family Bible," he said slowly. "Filed with it tucked into the back pages was my father's original surveyor's letter, the man who walked this land with him before he ever filed the claim, confirming boundaries, dating everything in his own hand months before the official filing." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Surveyor's been dead 8 years now, but his son still lives 2 counties over, took up his father's trade. If he's kept his father's old records, if there's any correspondence confirming the original survey, then we'd have proof beyond any lie Grant's bought men could tell." Eleanor finished, hope flaring bright and urgent in her chest. "How far is 2 counties over?" 2 days' hard ride, Caleb said. "Maybe less if the weather holds." "Then we don't have time to waste standing here talking about it." Caleb caught her hand before she could move toward the horses. "Eleanor, I need you to stay here this time. Not because I don't trust you beside me. God knows you've proven that a dozen times over already. But because if I'm gone 2 days chasing this proof, this ranch needs someone here who can hold everyone together. Keep the witnesses safe. Keep the neighbors organized if Grant tries anything while my back's turned. Eleanor wanted desperately to argue, every instinct screaming against letting him ride off alone into potentially hostile territory, while Grant's hired men still lurked at the edges of their fragile safety. But she recognized the truth in what he was saying, recognized too the trust he was placing in her by asking her to hold this fragile alliance together in his absence, rather than simply ordering her to stay behind for her own protection. Take Tom Ferris with you, she said finally. You shouldn't ride alone, not with your ribs still healing, not with Grant's men still willing to strike anywhere they think they can get away with it. Caleb nodded, some of the tension easing from his shoulders at her agreement. I'll ride hard, be back within 2 days if the weather cooperates and the surveyor's son has what we need. And if he doesn't, Caleb's expression darkened. Then we'll need to find another way to prove Grant's men are lying, and we'll need to find it fast, because the circuit judge arrives in 3 days, regardless of what proof we've managed to gather by then. He left within the hour, Tom Ferris riding beside him, both men pushing their horses hard toward the distant county line, while Eleanor watched from the porch until they disappeared entirely from view, her chest tight with a fear she refused to let show in front of the neighbors and witnesses, depending on her to hold everything steady in Caleb's absence. The 2 days that followed tested every ounce of resolve Eleanor possessed. She organized watch rotations among the men who'd stayed behind, tended to Jesse's ailing father with the same careful patience she'd once given her own mother, kept Clara's spirits from breaking under the strain of waiting, and fielded a tense visit from Deputy Reeves, informing her that Grant himself had been seen riding toward the county line in the same general direction Caleb had traveled, a piece of news that sent ice through her veins and kept her awake long into both nights, straining for the sound of returning hoofbeats that never quite came soon enough. It was on the evening of the second day, just as the light was beginning to fail, and Eleanor's fear had climbed to something nearly unbearable, that a lone rider finally appeared on the ridge above the ranch, moving fast, urgent, and for one terrible suspended moment, Eleanor couldn't tell whether the approaching figure carried salvation or disaster. Eleanor's hand flew to the rifle propped beside the porch door, every muscle coiled tight until the rider drew close enough for the last light to catch his face, and the breath she'd been holding for 2 days broke out of her in a sob of pure relief. Caleb. She was off the porch and running before she'd fully registered moving, and he swung down from his exhausted horse just in time to catch her as she reached him, both of them clinging to each other in the fading light, while Tom Ferris rode in more slowly, behind, equally travel-worn, but grinning despite it. You found it. Eleanor breathed against his shoulder. Not quite a question, because something in the set of his exhausted face already told her the answer. Surveyor's son kept every record his father ever wrote, Caleb said, pulling back just enough to look at her, his eyes bright with something fierce and triumphant, despite the dust and exhaustion caked into every line of him. Original field notes dated a full 4 months before my father's official filing. Boundary markers matching exact to the acre what's recorded at the county office. Man practically fell over himself getting it copied and certified once I explained what was at stake. Then Grant's lie falls apart the moment the judge sees it. Eleanor said, hope surging so hard through her chest it nearly hurt. Better than that. Caleb reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document worn soft at the creases from 2 days of careful handling. Surveyor's son remembered something else. Said his father used to talk about a rancher up near the gulch who tried buying out half the valley's water claims years back, offering settlers pennies on the dollar for land he knew was about to triple in value once the railroad survey went public. Man's father refused to sign anything without full disclosure, on principle. Grant's grandfather, it turns out. Same scheme 1 generation removed. Eleanor stared at him. You're saying this isn't the first time someone in Grant's family has tried this. I'm saying it's a pattern old as this valley itself, Caleb said grimly, and I intend to make sure the judge hears every piece of it. Behind them, the gathered witnesses and neighbors had begun drifting out from the cabin, and the makeshift camp scattered across the yard, drawn by the commotion of Caleb's return. And within minutes, the whole exhausted, hopeful company had assembled to hear the news firsthand. Clara Doss wept openly at the confirmation of everything her husband's old survey notes had suggested. Jesse Cobb's father, weak but alert, gripped Caleb's hand with more strength than Eleanor would have thought him capable of, murmuring something too quiet to hear, but clearly heartfelt. 2 days, Deputy Reeves said, arriving at the edge of the gathered crowd, his own relief evident despite his official bearing. Judge arrives in 2 days' time. This ought to settle things clean, assuming Grant doesn't have another trick left up his sleeve. He does, Caleb said, and something in his tone made the whole yard go quiet. Same trick he's used every time before: money and fear. But he's running low on both, and he doesn't know it yet. The 2 days that followed passed in a strange, taut mixture of preparation and waiting, the entire gathered community at the ranch working together with the quiet efficiency of people who had finally found solid ground to stand on after weeks of uncertain footing. Eleanor spent hours organizing testimonies, helping Clara and Jesse, and even Duncan, who had become an unlikely but steadfast ally in the weeks since his own change of heart, prepare clear, sequential accounts of everything they'd witnessed and experienced. Caleb, for his part, rode into town twice to confer with the sheriff and to ensure the certified survey documents were properly filed and ready for the judge's review each time, returning with his jaw a little tighter, his eyes a little more watchful, as though he could feel Grant's desperation sharpening somewhere just beyond sight. "He's selling off assets," Caleb reported after his second trip, dropping into the chair across from Eleanor at the kitchen table, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "Bank teller let it slip to Mrs. Pruitt, who naturally told half the town within the hour. Grant's liquidating what he can quiet-like. Man's either planning to run before the judge arrives, or he's raising every last dollar he can scrape together for one final push." "Which do you think it is?" Eleanor asked, though something cold in her stomach already suspected the answer. "Man like Grant doesn't run," Caleb said grimly. "Not when running means admitting defeat to a valley full of people he's spent years believing were beneath him. No, I think he's raising money for something, and I don't like not knowing what." They didn't have to wait long to find out. The evening before the circuit judge was scheduled to arrive, a commotion at the edge of the ranch's makeshift camp drew Eleanor from the cabin to find Deputy Reeves arguing heatedly with a man Eleanor didn't recognize. Well-dressed, carrying himself with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, flanked by 2 armed men who bore the unmistakable look of hired muscle rather than honest ranch hands. "This is a peaceable gathering on private land," Reeves was saying, his hand resting near his own weapon. "You've got no cause to be here." "I've got every cause," the stranger replied smoothly. "Name's Everett Cross. I represent certain financial interest in this territory, and I've come to make Mr. Walker a final generous offer before matters proceed any further tomorrow." Caleb appeared at Eleanor's side, his expression hardening the moment he registered the stranger's presence. "I know that name," he said quietly, for Eleanor's ears alone. "Cross is a fixer, man who handles the ugly business other men don't want their own hands dirtied with. If Grant sent him, it means he's out of legitimate options entirely." "Mr. Walker," Cross called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "A word if you'd permit it." Caleb stepped forward, and Eleanor followed close behind him, refusing to be left out of whatever this final confrontation held. "Say your piece," Caleb said, his voice flat and hard. "Mr. Grant is prepared to offer a substantial settlement," Cross said, producing a folded document from his coat with practiced ease. $15,000 for the water rights in dispute, along with a full withdrawal of the fraudulent claim currently filed against your father's original survey. All charges against Mr. Grant related to recent unfortunate incidents would be quietly dropped as well in exchange for your agreement to withdraw your own testimony before tomorrow's hearing. The offer hung in the air, staggering in its size, more money than Caleb had likely seen in his entire life, more than enough to rebuild every burned structure, restock every scattered herd, secure the ranch's future for generations to come. Eleanor watched Caleb's face, carefully watched the flicker of something that might have been temptation cross his features before hardening into something else entirely. "And if I refuse?" Caleb asked. Cross's polite expression didn't waver, though something colder settled behind his eyes. "Then Mr. Grant intends to contest every piece of evidence you present tomorrow, drag this case through appeals for years if necessary, and ensure that everyone who testified against him today finds their lives considerably more difficult going forward. Witnesses have a way of losing their nerve when the fight drags on long enough. Mr. Walker, families have a way of finding themselves unable to secure loans, unable to sell crops at fair prices, unable to find work when every business in 3 counties suddenly develops a reluctance to deal with them." "Oh, that's a threat," Eleanor said sharply, stepping forward, despite Caleb's hand rising slightly to hold her back. "That's simply how these things tend to unfold, ma'am," Cross said smoothly. "Mr. Grant would prefer to avoid such unpleasantness. $15,000 buys a great deal of peace, Mr. Walker. I'd urge you to consider it seriously." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs, watching him weigh a decision that would determine not just his own future, but the future of every person gathered on his land who had risked everything to stand against Grant's tyranny. "You know what my father used to say about men like Silas Grant?" Caleb said, finally his voice low and steady. "Said a man who has to buy his way out of his own crimes has already lost the only thing worth having the ability to look his neighbors in the eye without shame. $15,000 doesn't buy that back, Mr. Cross. Nothing does." "Mr. Walker, you can tell Grant I said no." Caleb continued, his voice hardening with each word. "Tell him I said the same thing I told his hired men who cut my fences, and the same thing I told the men who tried burning my barn a second time, and the same thing I'll keep telling him until a judge finally makes him answer for every family in this valley he's tried to crush. This land isn't for sale. Not for $15,000, not for $50,000. Not for any price a man like Grant could ever offer." Cross's polite mask finally slipped something genuinely surprised flickering behind his composed expression, as though refusal of this magnitude had rarely if ever crossed his experience. "You understand what you're choosing, Walker. A fight that could cost you everything against a settlement that costs you nothing but silence." "I understand exactly what I'm choosing," Caleb said. "I'm choosing to stand with every person who showed up to fight a fire that wasn't their responsibility to fight. I'm choosing a woman who taught me that decency means something even when it costs you. And I'm choosing to make sure Silas Grant never gets to do to another family what he tried doing to mine." Cross studied him for a long moment, then folded the document back into his coat with slow, deliberate movements. "Then I suppose there's nothing further to discuss." He turned to his 2 armed companions. "We're finished here." They mounted their horses and rode off into the gathering dusk, leaving behind a yard full of people who had just watched $15,000 more money than most of them would see in a lifetime, refused on their behalf without a moment's real hesitation. "Caleb," Eleanor said softly once Cross and his men had disappeared from view, "are you certain that money could have rebuilt everything twice over?" "Money built on somebody else's silence isn't worth having," Caleb said, reaching for her hand. "Besides, I already told you I'm not the same man who spent 10 years thinking he could buy his own peace through solitude. Some things matter more than money, Eleanor. You taught me that whether you meant to or not." Around them, the gathered witnesses and neighbors had gone quiet, absorbing what they'd just witnessed, until Clara Doss finally broke the silence, her voice thick with emotion. "My husband died believing men like Grant always win in the end. I only wish he could see this." "He'll see it tomorrow," Caleb said firmly. "All of us will." The morning of the hearing dawned clear and bright, the kind of pristine Montana summer morning that seemed almost deliberately at odds with the tension gripping everyone gathered to travel into Miners Gulch for the circuit judge's arrival. The town's small courthouse, usually reserved for minor disputes and property filings, had been transformed into something resembling a proper court of law, with the circuit judge, a stern, silver-haired man named Judge Elias Whitfield, presiding from behind a borrowed desk with an expression that suggested he had seen every manner of frontier scheme and had little patience remaining for elaborate lies. Eleanor sat beside Caleb in the crowded courtroom, her hand tight in his beneath the table, watching as the case unfolded across the long, tense morning. Jesse Cobb testified first, his voice steady, despite visible nerves laying out every detail of Grant's scheme with the clear, unflinching honesty of a young man determined to make right what he'd once helped make wrong. Frank Pruitt, testifying from his jail cell transport under armed guard, corroborated every word, his own testimony offered in exchange for a reduced sentence that still promised significant time behind bars. Clara Doss followed, her voice trembling but clear, laying out the railroad survey information that revealed the true motive behind Grant's year-long campaign against Caleb's water rights. And then, Caleb himself took the stand, presenting the certified survey documents, proving his father's claim predated any dispute Grant's paid witnesses had attempted to manufacture his voice steady and unwavering, even as Grant's own lawyer attempted with increasing desperation to poke holes in testimony that simply would not break. Silas Grant sat throughout the proceedings, with his composure visibly fraying his face, growing paler with each witness, each piece of evidence stacking against him like stones building an unbreakable wall. "Mr. Grant," Judge Whitfield said finally, once the last of the testimony had been heard, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had made up his mind well before the formalities required him to announce it. "I have heard testimony today describing a scheme of fraud, intimidation, arson, and attempted witness tampering that represents one of the more brazen attempts at land theft I have encountered in 20 years riding this circuit. The evidence presented certified survey documents, sworn testimony from multiple independent witnesses, and corroborating confessions from your own hired accomplices leaves no reasonable doubt as to the fraudulent nature of your claims against Mr. Walker's property." Grant's lawyer rose to object, but the judge silenced him with a single sharp gesture. "Furthermore," Whitfield continued, "the evidence suggests this scheme extends beyond a single property dispute, implicating a broader pattern of predatory land acquisition, tied to advanced knowledge of railroad survey plans. Information you appear to have used to defraud not only Mr. Walker, but potentially numerous other landholders throughout this valley who may have been pressured into selling property at unfair value under false pretenses." The courtroom had gone utterly silent, every eye fixed on Grant, whose face had drained of nearly all color. "I am ruling in full favor of Mr. Walker's claim," Whitfield said. "His water rights and land ownership are confirmed unbroken and unchallenged. Furthermore, given the severity of the fraud, arson, and intimidation demonstrated in this proceeding, I am referring this case to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for full criminal charges against Mr. Grant, including, but not limited to, arson, conspiracy, fraud, and attempted witness intimidation. Bail will be set pending trial, and I would strongly suggest, Mr. Grant, that you retain considerably better counsel than has served you in this courtroom today." The gavel came down with a finality that seemed to echo through the packed courtroom, and for a moment, nobody moved, as though the entire gathered crowd needed a beat to fully absorb what had just happened. That the man who had terrorized this valley for years had finally truly lost. Then Clara Doss began to weep, and Jesse's father gripped his son's shoulder with visible pride, and somewhere behind them, Mrs. Pruitt let out a whoop that broke the tension entirely, sending the courtroom into a wave of relieved, disbelieving celebration. Eleanor turned to find Caleb watching her rather than the celebrating crowd, his eyes bright with an emotion too large for words, and when he pulled her into his arms, right there in the crowded courtroom, neither of them cared who witnessed it. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "Eleanor, it's finally over." "Not over," she corrected softly, pulling back just enough to look at him. "Beginning. This is where it begins, Caleb. Everything we get to build now that he can't take it from us anymore." Silas Grant was led from the courthouse in restraints. An hour later, his once immaculate appearance now disheveled, his composure entirely shattered, and as he passed the gathered crowd outside, his eyes found Caleb's with a final bitter glare. "This isn't finished, Walker," he spat. "It is for you," Caleb replied, his voice steady and without malice, though every word carried the weight of finality. "You spent years trying to convince this valley that money and fear made you untouchable. Turns out, all it took was people brave enough to stop being afraid." Grant said nothing more, allowed himself to be loaded into the wagon that would transport him to the territorial jail to await his criminal trial. And as the wagon rolled away down the main street of Miners Gulch, something in the town itself seemed to exhale a held breath, finally released after years of quiet, simmering fear. The weeks that followed brought changes to the valley that Eleanor could scarcely have imagined when she'd first stood humiliated on that dusty road, rejected and alone. With Grant's schemes exposed and his assets seized pending trial, several families he'd defrauded over the years came forward with their own claims, recovering land and money they'd long believed lost forever. The railroad survey, once public, brought genuine, honest opportunity to the valley rather than the exploitation. Grant had planned a depot built with fair compensation to every landholder involved, rather than land stolen through fraud and intimidation. Caleb's barn was fully rebuilt within a month, better and sturdier than before, the whole community turning out once more, this time in celebration rather than crisis, to raise the final beams together. Jesse Cobb took up permanent work on the ranch, his father's health slowly improving with proper medicine, now affordable thanks to fair wages and a community no longer strangled by Grant's predatory lending. Clara Doss became something of a fixture at the ranch as well, her quiet strength and steady friendship with Eleanor deepening into something like the family neither of them had realized they were missing. And Caleb. Caleb changed in ways Eleanor watched unfold. With quiet growing wonder, the careful walls he'd built over 10 years of solitude coming down piece by piece, replaced not by vulnerability alone, but by a kind of steady, hard-won joy that seemed to settle more naturally into him with each passing week. It was on a warm evening in late summer, nearly 3 months after the day Eleanor had first stood abandoned on the road outside town, that Caleb led her out to the ridge overlooking the ranch. The same ridge where he'd first confessed feelings he'd been too afraid to name plainly, where the mountains stretched out below them, in a view that had once represented only solitude, and now represented something entirely different. "I've been thinking," Caleb said, his voice carrying a nervousness Eleanor had rarely heard from him, "about something my mother used to say. Said a home isn't built from wood and stone alone. Said it's built from the people willing to stay through the hardest seasons, who choose each other again every single day, even when choosing would be easier some other way." Eleanor felt her heart begin to race, watching him reach into his coat with hands that trembled slightly, despite everything he'd faced these past months without flinching. "Eleanor Hayes," he said, dropping to one knee in the tall summer grass, holding out a ring that Eleanor recognized instantly as having belonged to his mother. The same delicate band she'd glimpsed once in a small wooden box on his dresser and never asked about. "You arrived in this valley believing you had nothing left to offer anyone. You were wrong about that the moment you knelt beside my father's horse and saved what I thought was already lost. You've been proving me wrong about what I thought I needed from life every single day since. I don't want to spend one more morning without you beside me. Will you marry me?" Eleanor was crying before she'd even fully processed the question, dropping to her knees in the grass across from him, her hands finding his face the way they had that first raw morning after the fire. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying all at once. "Yes, Caleb Walker, 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that shook. And when he kissed her this time, there was no urgency of crisis behind it, no desperation born of fear or danger. Only the steady, certain joy of two people who had fought together for everything they now finally fully possessed. Below them, the ranch stretched out in the golden evening light. The rebuilt barn standing strong and proud. The herd grazing peacefully in pastures no longer threatened by any man's greed. The cabin where Eleanor had first found shelter, now humming with the warmth of a home fully restored to life after 10 long years of careful, guarded silence. "You know," Eleanor said softly, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched the sun sink lower behind the peaks. "When that stagecoach driver left me standing alone on that road, I thought my life had ended before it had properly begun. I thought I had nothing left worth anyone's care or attention." "You were wrong," Caleb said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I know that now." Eleanor smiled, turning to look at him fully, at this man who had knelt beside her in the dust when the whole town turned away, who had trusted her with his father's horse and his sister's memory, and eventually his whole guarded heart. "I think I've never been more right about anything than I am about this, Caleb. About us. About what we built together out of everything that tried to break us apart." They were married 3 weeks later in a small, joyful ceremony held right there on the ranch, surrounded by every neighbor who had once looked away and had since learned through Eleanor and Caleb's example exactly what courage and decency could accomplish when people chose to stand together rather than remain silent. Clara Doss cried through the entire ceremony. Jesse Cobb, cleaned up and solemn in his best clothes, stood as one of Caleb's witnesses, his own redemption complete in a way that felt to everyone watching like a testament to exactly the kind of mercy this valley had learned to extend to those brave enough to seek it. Even Josiah Duncan attended, standing quietly near the back, offering Eleanor a genuine humbled smile when their eyes met across the gathered crowd, a silent acknowledgement of how far both of their lives had traveled since that first cruel morning on his porch. As the sun set over the mountain that had once represented only isolation and grief, and now stood as guardian over a home rebuilt from love, courage, and the unshakable belief that no person's worth could ever be measured by how easily others chose to abandon them. Caleb Walker held his new wife close and understood with a certainty that settled deep and permanent into his bones that he would never again spend a single day of his life afraid of what it might cost him to love someone fully. The mountain had stood silent and empty for 10 long years. Now at last it was finally completely unshakably home.